According to one man, history ended in 1992. The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama is a very good book, and it is generally considered to be the most famous piece of political philosophy of the past 35 years. The preface of the book starts with the easy joke that every single reader makes when they consider the title for all of 2 seconds. No, history did not literally end in 1992, and evidence for that is that another 32 years have since passed.
The End of History was written 30 years ago, and I have now spent 31 years being asked, well, what about the end of history? You know, wasn't that completely wrong? And
instead, what Fukuyama means to convey to us is that history is essentially a logical process of change. Fukuyama is a diehard Hegelian, and according to Hegel, history is inherently about change through conflict. Factions fight, and the best, toughest, smartest faction survives to fight the next one.
That was based not on economics, but on what he called the struggle for recognition. That lies behind, in a certain way, religion and movements like nationalism, but that ultimately it's not that it creates capitalist prosperity for us, but that it is a political system that by giving us individual rights, recognizes our dignity as human beings.
During this process of life and death, only the best ideas remain. The survivors adopt their favorite ideas, and if they are truly good, then they are implemented without fault, and if they are bad, they fail upon arrival. After thousands of years, tribalism became monarchism. Monarchism failed and led to liberalism. Liberalism to democracy, which led to capitalism, and in reaction to it, communism. Then, as a backlash against those two, arrived fascism. At the tail end of the 20th century, with fascism in rubble and communism having collapsed in on itself, capitalism became the ultimate form of human governance. Fukuyama's thesis is that with the end of the Cold War means the end of conflict, change, and thus we have arrived at the end of history itself. Capitalism and democracy have won the game of societal evolution, and society cannot possibly become any more efficient or evolve past capitalism, because the market keeps opposing factions in check, and democracy keeps the market from expanding beyond itself. So these two forces are supposed to work like yin and yang, and according to Fukuyama, they are just tremendously effective. I might be a bit of a grouchy communist, but I do find this book to be genuinely insightful, thoughtfully empathetic, and passionately argued for. Fukuyama is not saying that we should all become lapdogs for bankers. Instead, he believes that liberal capitalism has the unique ability to balance out its own worst tendencies, and because these systems are prone to human error, it is our responsibility to be better people so that we can live up to its ideals.
These economic explanations for democracy, I think, are ultimately not really satisfying because in the last analysis, people don't want democracy for economic reasons. I mean, you can have, a high-growth society without a lot of political freedom. I mean, there are a lot of countries in Asia, Singapore and Thailand and so forth, that are like that. And I think that, if you look more deeply at what it is that drives societies to want democracy, you always end up with a non-economic cause.
And because his book is like 350 pages long, he really gets into the weeds of the critiques that you may have. To make it even clearer, I like this book. I don't agree with everything in it, as we will discuss for... Dear God. I do think that it's a great place to start for anyone who is interested in understanding modern politics, which is quite the compliment from me because he was part of the Reagan administration. It's noteworthy to say that after the beginning of the War on Terror, Fukuyama distanced himself from American conservative parties. Better late than never, I suppose. I think the end of history is something that we exist within. The current state is obsessed with not changing anything structurally. Fukuyama thinks that this is a great thing. It has that yin and yang quality he spoke about. I think it's terrible, because if this is as good as anything is ever going to be, then... oy vey, that sucks. This video will follow this line of logic because, to me, it best describes the state of affairs and the ethos of postmodern capitalism. Just because I adopt it doesn't mean that I thoroughly agree with it. So, even though I was very impressed with Fukuyama's argumentation, I had 3 major critiques. When we say that America, and by proxy capitalism, won the Cold War, we'd like to imagine that it was just a clean exchange of ideas. The Soviets were simply falling apart at the seams due to corruption and disorganization. And it is true that Soviet communism was quite flawed. 0% of communism has ever worked, and every communist in the world will tell you that. Doesn't mean we should stop trying. But this perspective misses the forest for the trees, and it distorts why the Cold War actually happened in the first place. An interesting critique at the end of history comes from journalist Naomi Klein in her book The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. In this work, she describes the rise of Milton Friedman-inspired economics, or as we might call it today, neoliberalism. Every boring YouTuber who thinks they're cleverer than they are brings it up somewhere. But neoliberalism is a state which exists in service of the market. The purpose of the state is to ensure that the strength of the dollar is reliable from day to day. The legal and police systems exist to protect private property, and finally, it creates new markets through privatization. Klein gives a history of over a dozen developing countries around the world that democratically voted for socialism and/or communism. Only nerds understand the difference between the ideologies, just roll with it. And she details how, in each and every case, whether it be Chile, Indonesia, Iran, or South Africa, in one way or another, calls for Marxist politics were snuffed out. Sometimes this was via a proxy war, sometimes leaders were just assassinated by America. Quite often that was the case, and sometimes it happened after a natural disaster. In wake of this chaos, America and the West would introduce free market capitalism to, quote-unquote, get the country back on its feet. You know, the big guy helping out the baby nation. Instead of bringing each country into a new prosperity and increasing the total happiness of its citizenship, which you would expect a political system that ended history to be able to do, in each case, resources were stolen, people were killed, and organizations were set up to mine every single dollar possible for mostly Western interests. It was imperialism with extra steps. This ensured that these countries, who once expressed interest in socialism, had no chance to become an autonomous nation. So coincidentally, I read these two books back to back in 2021, I think, and I found that Klein's thesis was, in part, a response to Fukuyama. To quote her directly, "It was true, as Fukuyama noted, that there was an emerging and irreplaceable consensus that all people have the right to govern themselves democratically. But only in the State Department's most vivid fantasies was that desire for democracy accompanied by citizens clamoring for an economic system that would strip away job protections and cause the mass layoffs. In 1989, history was taking an exhilarating turn, entering a period of genuine openness and possibility, so it was no coincidence that Fukuyama from his perch at the State Department chose precisely that moment to slam the history book shut. There was no real point in Fukuyama's dramatic end of history announcement at the University of Chicago lecture in 1989. He wasn't actually claiming that there were no other ideas in the world, but merely that, with communism collapsing, there were no other ideas sufficiently powerful enough to constitute a head-to-head competitor. What we learn from Klein is that history is not actually about the best and most logical ideas winning. It's about chaos, and it's about power. History is not fair, nor is it logical. Instead, it is written and cemented by those who can lie, cheat, and steal enough to keep their competition out of the race. There is nothing logical or utilitarian about neoliberal Friedman economics, because it only serves the ultra-wealthy, and they wouldn't have had to have assassinated a whole bunch of socialists to force it to work. Another critique of capitalism being the winning state of politics is that we cannot imagine how things could be any better than they are right now. Consider Slavoj Žižek and his famous aphorism that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
I'm eating from the trash can all the time.
But I'm not going to focus on the futility of pretending that there are no alternatives. Instead, I am more interested in what happens to citizens who drown in that futility. Timothy Snyder is an acclaimed and popular historian, and in his fascinating book, The Road to Unfreedom, he chronicles the rise of modern Russia from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin, along with his many wars and antics. This isn't a straight history book, as Snyder speculates that Russia exaggerates some of the worst qualities of capitalism, and in doing so, it perverts any virtues that it once had. The tendency towards monopoly, the infinite growth problem, all of these force the wealthy to use underhanded tricks to continue to run a broken system. And what happened in Russia is that truth became a hindrance to said growth. The study of history is only useful insofar as you can use it to get your own way. Under a neoliberal oligarchy, the end of history represents a politics of inevitability. That means that the future will consist of more of the present. Your phone might upgrade, your job might be made a bit easier, but the structure of everything will reliably stay the same. You will have the same kind of job and you will work for the same kind of bosses and live in the same kind of insulated house, and society will only look different due to technological and aesthetic advancement. The future is inevitable, babes. Why struggle to change it when it will be perfect? Of course, the future will feature plenty of struggles. War, climate change, famine, recession, disease. Inevitability does not mean that these things won't happen, but it does mean that we shouldn't try too hard to prevent them because everything is as good as it will ever be.
There are a couple of problems with this idea. One of the problems with this idea is that it completely takes responsibility away. If we know how things are going to go anyway, it doesn't really matter what you or I do. But then the other problem, the fundamental problem, the thing we're experiencing now, is that this idea of progress, this notion that we know the rules, this feeling that there's only one course of history and we're on it, this eventually cracks.
When you live under a politics of inevitability, it is incredibly easy to slip into a politics of eternity. This only happens when inevitability collapses in on itself. Instead of looking towards the future, the state looks back upon nostalgia and it aims to regress social and economic problems back to how they looked 20 to 40 years ago. Our story of triumph becomes one of eternal victimhood. Time is no longer a line into the future, but a circle that endlessly returns to the same threats from the past. Within inevitability, no one is responsible because we all know that the details will sort themselves out for the better. Within eternity, no one is responsible because we all know that the enemy is coming no matter what we do. Eternity politicians spread that conviction that government cannot aid society as a whole, but can only guard against threats. Progress gives way to doom. Inevitability and eternity have specific propaganda styles. Inevitability politicians spin facts into a web of well-being. Eternity politicians suppress facts in order to dismiss the reality that people are freer and richer in other countries, and that the idea of reforms could be formulated on the basis of knowledge. The inherent tendencies of neoliberalism encourage this complacency, and the idea that nothing can be changed because we have completed our political evolution only benefits the rich. It is a small lie that we tell ourselves to relinquish responsibilities for hyper problems like climate change, homelessness, institutional racism, and the like. The tendency towards eternity also carves out an exception for itself, because it is the only thing that is evolved and good. Everything else then is its enemy. This is how Russia framed itself as innocent, all the while they flagrantly invade Ukraine and tamper with other countries' elections, because virtue has to look exactly like yourself, otherwise it is sin. Snyder even convincingly argues that the rise of figures like Donald Trump in America herald the dawn of eternity politics in the West, which is a forecast that is tremendously troubling. One of my biggest problems with the end of history as a concept is that George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a really vicious and outspoken anti-Semite. Scholar David Nirenberg dedicates several chapters of his book Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, to how Enlightenment philosophers tried to understand Jews. Famous rationalists like Kant, Marx, and Heine used Judaism to convey philosophy, almost always in negative ways. Hegel is of particular fascination because he is considered to be the definitive rationalist, and yet his writing on Judaism was so utterly irrational. Hegel was infamous for critiquing art for being too Jewish for his own tastes, meaning degenerate or aggressive, and his line of reasoning would go on to inspire Nazi philosophers like Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt. Fukuyama, being a Hegelian thinker, takes on many of the base assumptions that Hegel made about the practice of history. And I'm not saying that Fukuyama is an anti-Semite, to my knowledge, but I find it curious that his book only mentions Judaism in the context of Abrahamic religion more generally, as if he didn't really want to confront these assumptions about how they hinder his notion of history being a purely rational and fair process. He certainly would have noticed these beliefs if he had studied Hegel as closely as he claimed to have, especially since anti-Judaism and antisemitism were tremendously important factors in how history actually unfolded. Now, of course, Fukuyama is a political scientist, not a god. He cannot be expected to think of every single contingency for a book that he wrote 30-some years ago, and in more modern editions he tackled some of these critiques, the imperialism, the complacency. But still, he barely engages with the nature of anti-Semitism. And not engaging with Judaism outside of monotheistic religion is strange because anti-Judaism was fundamental to understanding how history actually evolved. I covered this history from antiquity to the French Revolution in episode 1 of this series, and I explored the creation of anti-Semitism and the rise of eugenics in episodes 2 and 3. That was how the history unfolded, but in this final episode, I want to explore how anti-Semitism works within the mind, under neoliberalism and within a state of inevitability. I want to explore how anti-Semitism invades the mind, see how it colors the anti-Semite's vision, and see what we can do to fight it. Let's explore the psychology and philosophy of antisemitism. Part 1. Psychology. Before we get started, I want to let you know that I plan to discuss the link between conspiratorial thinking and anti-Semitism throughout this video. As we've discussed at length throughout this series, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion act as a kind of blueprint for modern anti-Semitism. It provides a structure to an otherwise incoherent belief system. The Protocols have coloured how we view modern conspiracy theories because the structure is just so useful for cognitive gap filling. And of course, anti-Semitism is worse now than it has been in decades. I want this video to be in conversation with my video on conspiracy theories. While I have written this video to be comprehensible all by its lonesome, I recommend at least having a brief look at episode 4 of my Port Arthur series. I'm not saying this to gain retention time, as useless in real life as that is, but because I genuinely believe that your viewership will be enhanced by having that video fresh in your mind. I will cite the conspiracism video a few times in the coming chapters. I love it when writers cite themselves. It always comes across as like, bro, trust me, I'm right. But I will do that when I don't feel like rehashing work already discussed on this channel. Further, I want to state here that I'm in the process of getting a media degree. I'm not an expert on philosophy, sociology, or psychology. I have done extensive amounts of homework to get this video together, and I have peer-reviewed it to the best of my own ability. But I want to say that I'm not an authority on this topic. I see myself as a synthesizer of literature, a curator, and I perform said work with the aim of educating and entertaining an audience. Thus, this will be several interconnected essays aiming to synthesize and provide perspectives on anti-Semitism that you may not have heard before. I have worked on this video for a little over a year at this point, so I hope that you will find it worth your time, and I want to let you know that I am entirely open to good faith critiques of my work because I want to get better at what I do. Without further waiting, Chapter 1. Schema Jew. The first thing you need to know about anti-Semitism is that it is sometimes libidinal. That means that it is an almost automatic process for the anti-Semite. Libidinal is a Freudian term, and it does not refer solely to sexual libido, but it refers to a cognitive energy, a drive in the human mind. I spoke about the role of libidinal drives in my video on conspiracism, and I want to dedicate this chapter to showing my math on this phenomenon. When psychologists say that something is libidinal, most of the time they are referring to such things as hunger or thirst, but it is important to know that libidinal drives can actually be learned from external sources. In the conspiracism video, I discussed how conspiratorial thinking is ingrained into the human condition. We are pattern-seeking creatures, and sometimes those patterns end up being Alex Jones doing 9/11 himself to boost his radio career. I also talked about how our tendency towards trust is generally the default mode of human existence, and our tendency towards blatant distrust rather than cautious mistrust can sometimes be learned from epistemically dodgy sources. I want to propose that one such dodgy behaviour is the tendency towards anti-Semitism. There is a rich body of scientific work linking anti-Semitic rambling to pathology. I don't think that anti-Semites have anything physically wrong with them, and their convictions are not a symptom of a clinical mental illness. That would be wrong in my view, because there is no part of the brain at which you can look at and say, there's the anti-Semitism nurse, prepare the lobotomy. I am always skeptical of reification like this. In spite of all of this, I do find it compelling to consider anti-Semitism as a kind of social neurosis. Of course, unlike our tendency towards conspiracy, it is not ingrained into us from birth. Babies are not conceived with an anti-Semitic gene. Anti-Semitism is entirely a learned and social behaviour. It is heritable but not hereditary, if you catch my drift. In this series, we have explored how anti-Semitic rhetoric has led directly to violence against Jews. They are almost obsessional in their convictions. When we compare this to conspiracy theorists, we see that while they are at times fanatical, they really aim to commit violence against those they dislike. Rhetoric is not action, and historically, anti-Semites are far more violent, where theorists are generally content with their paranoia. I want to argue that anti-Semitism is a symptom of something deeply embedded within the anti-Semite's mind. So you might be wondering, rightfully so, that if anti-Semitism is an automatic process but it also isn't ingrained into us from birth, then how can it be libidinal exactly? In his essay, Anti-Semite and Jew, Jean-Paul Sartre aims to elucidate how the internal mechanics of anti-Semitism work. Early in his book, he shares an anecdote about a former classmate who failed his literature exam. This unnamed classmate confided in Sartre that he failed the exam because of the Jews. A curious Sartre asked him why he thought this so, to which the classmate replied that he could never have passed it, not because Jews wanted him specifically to fail, but because it was an academic exercise aimed towards Jews. He reasoned only someone of Hebrew origin could understand the great Roman poet Virgil better than him. So Sartre asked him if he had studied for this test, and the classmate confessed to him that he hadn't. And this didn't bother him in the slightest, of course, because in the wake of his failure, he decided that the test was not worth passing. Thus, to explain his failure, he made use of two systems of interpretation like those madmen who, when too far gone in their madness, pretend to be the king of Hungary but, if questioned sharply, admit to being shoemakers. His thoughts moved on two planes without his being the least embarrassed by it. As a matter of fact, he will in time manage to justify his past laziness on the grounds that it really would be too stupid to prepare for an examination in which Jews are passed on preference to good Frenchmen, and to be able to decide that amongst the 26 competitors who were more successful than himself, it was the Jew who robbed him of his place. He must a priori have given preference to his conduct in life to reasoning based on passion. Far from experience producing his idea of the Jew, it was the latter which explained his experience. To which Sartre most famously asserts that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. Now, there is quite a lot of academic debate about whether or not this is a useful anecdote, or whether it should be applied as grandly as Sartre does here. It kind of infers a chicken or egg model of bigotry, and on that level it is silly, but this literalism misses the point that Sartre was trying to make with this story. We will return to this paper in chapter 6 because it's a lot, but I want to use this notion as an epistemic prognosis. The Jew is a stock stereotype in the anti-Semite's mind, their personal villain to struggle against. And this is why they can logically use what I've called the dialectic recludity of the imagined Jew, and not feel cognitive dissonance, because they are dealing with imagined figures so often that they arrive fully formed automatically. A heuristic is a mental shortcut that we develop with practice. The classic example is someone who gains the optimal stance while they play sports like golf. You become so accustomed to standing in said stance that after enough times it becomes second nature. You don't have to think about it. The same can be said for the mathematically inclined. The formula becomes invisible and the answers come quickly. Activities that once required cognitive effort take on an automatic quality, a gut feeling. I argue in the Conspiracism video that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's notion of System 1 on 2, or gut and brain impulses, are part of the mental pathways of Conspiracism. I want to argue that both System 1, or gut, and the mental heuristics strengthen anti-Semitic convictions, and further exacerbate the anti-Semitic neurosis. Let's return to Sartre's classmate who didn't study for his literature exam. Let's attempt to follow his train of thought. Sartre assumed that the man's failure was attributed to his own laziness. Let's assume for argument's sake that if he had passed, he would have not blamed the Jews for rigging the test, because anti-Semites don't like to give Jews imagined and real credit for the anti-Semites' benefit. We don't hear them praise people like George Soros or whatever for putting for a bill that leads to them getting a pay rise, Damn the Jews for conniving and manipulating the economic system to benefit me. This man failed his test. He failed because A, he didn't study due to laziness, or B, he didn't study because he thought only Jews were equipped to understand the questions. C, he actually likely used both A and B in his mind to justify his failure, two systems as Sartre put it. 3. So, he didn't study because he thought the test itself was unfair and not worth passing. 4. His failure was further confirmation of his belief that the test was rigged. 5. The test was immoral to actually take seriously because he thought it was Jewish. Therefore, Jews were to blame for his failure on the test. His sense of morality was itself skewed, and due to several layers of rationalization, he decided that his failure was itself actually a kind of virtue. Passing would be immoral because the test was of degenerate quality, and it's better to fail and remain pure. It's tied up in narratives of sin, and it also allows for immoral behavior. Captain Dreyfus was obviously an innocent man, but if you convict him as a spy, it would be proof of a wider social problem that you already believe in, so convicting an innocent man is for the greater good, and you shouldn't think too hard about that, because that's what Jews want. Justice is Jewish if Jews win out. Recall in episode 1 the notion of the king protecting his own servy being seen as bending to the will of Jews, and not protecting his own authority and all. Now, I'm not going to say that the anti-Semitic heuristic exists, because that is too simple to explain the scope of the problem. Heuristics represent muscle memory and mental shortcuts. The legacy of Jew hatred is much more complicated than golf. I believe that what is actually happening is far more substantial in the human mind, and that itself is why anti-Semites are so averse to evidence. A year or so ago, I was seeing a psychologist, and he introduced the concept of schema to me. I was reminded of schema therapy while I was trying to comprehend how deeply embedded Jew hatred is in the anti-Semite's mind. So, what is a schema? Well, they're a mental construct abstract in a similar way to memory or intelligence. Schema represent your base assumptions about morality and justice. To further explain my point, I found a copy of Schema Therapy, which was written by Jeffrey Young and co. Within cognitive development, a schema is a pattern imposed on reality or experience to help individuals explain it, to mediate perception, and to guide their responses. A schema is an abstract representation of distinctive characteristics of an event, a kind of blueprint for the most salient elements. Within cognitive psychology, a schema can also be thought of as an abstract cognitive plan that serves as a guide for interpreting information and solving problems. There are generally 4 different clusters of schema. Person schema, which represents your concept of your physical self, your hair color, the size of your nose, how you view yourself as a distinct entity. Social schema, which are your base assumptions about what you consider to be moral behavior. Share your toys, buy your friend a coffee, don't be rude to the cashier. Self schema. Separate from person schema, this cluster is how you perceive yourself within a group. You are smart, you are funny, you are bad at maths, you like juice, you want to be a WWE SmackDown vs. Raw wrestler one day. Normal things. And event schema, which consists of your knowledge of social scripts and your knowledge of etiquette. You eat with a knife and fork. You don't tombstone the bride at the wedding. I just got back into wrestling after like 10 years and I'm full of goddamn wrestling jokes now. Consider schema then to be deeply embedded moral and social heuristics. Justice is good, family is safe. Being rude is bad. And as we develop, these assumptions grow more complicated. We realize that some people have more access to justice because the legal system is flawed, Fukuyama.
We're done when I say we're done.
Some family members are toxic and should be cut off, but the essential rightness of these libidinal assumptions are maintained. Justice and family are ultimately good. Kids who grow up in less than ideal households, though, may develop what are called maladaptive schema. Not all schemas are based on childhood trauma or mistreatment. Indeed, an individual can develop a dependence incompetence schema without experiencing a single instance of childhood trauma. Rather, the individual might have been completely sheltered or overprotected throughout childhood. However, although not all maladaptive schemas have trauma as their origin, all of them are destructive, and most of them are caused by noxious experiences that are repeated on a regular basis throughout childhood and adolescence. Our sense that family is safe will be disrupted if we are abused as a child, for instance. And these schemata, being embedded as our base assumptions of the world, hew our social relationships as we grow up. We may become afraid of intimacy because unconsciously we are reminded of our family's abuse. Because schema are libidinal in function, they are incredibly difficult to change, and Young and Co. present schema therapy as the solution to realign the patient's schema to something more beneficial and socially healthy to them. Schema are not solely attributed to children, though. Consider for a moment that the free market is a fundamental assumption of libertarians. Even when you demonstrate that the free market is easily corruptible, that the tendency towards monopoly constricts consumer freedom, and that people with more money have more freedom, it doesn't matter. The notion of the free market can be viewed as a kind of social schema, a law that is so deeply embedded into reality that it simply cannot be false, and anyone saying to the contrary is trying to undermine it. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Schemas are fundamental social and moral heuristics that, while libidinal, are socially learned. No one is born with a latent sense that family is good. It is something that is learned through the experience of love. And these learned phenomena, over time, become fundamental to our worldview. So I want to propose that antisemitism becomes libidinal by transforming into a schema. But before we do, it is worth considering a flaw in schema theory, because this scientific concept is a bit vague, isn't it? Like, if eating with a knife and fork is a schema, then is my preference for Red Bull over Monster Energy drinks a schema then? Is my belief that expressionist paintings are more aesthetically vibrant than mere impressionist ones then also a schema? What about my belief that Soundgarden are the best grunge band out of the big four? If mere social cues can become deeply embedded beliefs, then does that mean that anything can be a schema? And if that's true, then how is it useful for discussing anti-Semitism exactly? You have a knack for sophisticated retorts, dear viewers, so hopefully you're having a nice day behind the fourth wall. I reply that this is a very heavily contested issue, I think that there is an element of abstraction and reification to schema theory, and based on my own brief review of the literature, I do think that some practitioners are overly keen to apply schema therapy where it doesn't need to be. Knives and forks as eating utensils are definitely a mental shortcut that we take around other people, but it's nowhere near as significant as our belief in justice. Acknowledging all of this, I strongly believe schema theory to be relevant and useful in understanding anti-Semitism because schemas can help us to understand irrational impulses. We've explored throughout this series how anti-Semitism is closer to a moral conviction than a strict academic stance. The overwhelming weight of that conviction and how it leads people to do violence against Jews means that, as we'll discuss in the next chapter, trying to understand irrationality through the lens of academia can often be fruitless. Thus, I believe it useful to consider how this logic actually works within the mind. Schema theory is one of the most compelling ways in which I have come to understand anti-Semitism, thus I feel compelled to share it here. We've discussed at length throughout this series how the anti-Semite's greatest passion in life is his disdain for his Jew, and his passion clouds all moral, social, and logical considerations. The stock stereotype of the Jew becomes embedded in the mind so rigidly that it itself is the cause of anti-Semitic neurosis. So, what kind of schema would anti-Semitism be? Well, I would argue that it's a mix of self and social schema. The anti-Semite uses the stock stereotype of the Jew to define what he is against. The test is immoral to pass because it was Jewish, and thus, this heuristic is used to justify the Jew as, at once, capitalist and communist. Because the archetype is not physical, you can use it flexibly in different situations. And anti-Semitism is also a social schema because it colors what you think is socially acceptable. If I can invoke Lipstadt here, the anti-Semite's faith that Jews control the world leads into logically the Jews that all of his own personal problems are because of Jews. Because the amorphous figure of the Jew impedes justice and underlies his assumptions about the power relations between the rich and the poor, the anti-Semite can use the Jew to justify whatever he likes. His faith that Jews are evil incarnate leads him to seek reasons for Jews being just so. You might be wondering if there is also a conspiratorial schema as well. I've thought about that a lot, and I don't think so. Primarily because I haven't seen much research about it. I do think that there is a compelling argument to be made for it, but I don't have the academic conviction to advocate for it right now. And the primary factor for this position is that the belief in conspiracy is based upon a just world fallacy. The world is inherently just, some people are undermining the will of the people, and in response to this, the theorist creates expansive and incomprehensible theories in an attempt to maintain the just world. Anti-Semitism is different because of the breadth of belief. Anti-Semitism is at the same time racism, class anxiety, conspiracism, religious persecution, collective responsibility, and a kind of archetypal myth-making. Tendency towards conspiracy is just one aspect of something much larger than itself. So, if our gut impulses are the seed that grows within the mind of the theorist, then anti-Semitism is like a 4,000-year-old tree, deeply embedded and difficult to uproot. The biggest difference is, as we've discussed, that conspiracism is in all of us from birth. Anti-Semitism is learned from other anti-Semites. One is hereditary, and the other is strictly heritable. Another critique that schema practitioners might put forth is that maladaptive schema in children are usually the result of trauma or an abusive environment. So, it is important to emphasize that anti-Semitism is not the result of trauma. Anti-Semites are not traumatized by Jews, and as we will discuss in chapter 2, they project onto them everything they hate about themselves. They, in fact, have very little contact with actual Jews, and they disregard them as people so that their worldview is cleaner in their own mind's eye. There is a concept in schema therapy called schema surrender. This is one of 3 schema modes, coping mechanisms, which occur when the patient does not go through therapy, where avoidance urges the patient to avoid triggering the schema, and overcompensation makes them push everyone away to avoid being hurt. Surrender occurs when the patient allows their own worst impulses to wash over them because it is something they feel that they deserve.
When the patients surrender to a schema, they yield to it. They do not try to avoid it or fight it. They accept that the schema is true. They feel the emotional pain of the schema directly. They act in ways that confirm the schema. Without realizing what they're doing, they repeat schema-driven patterns so that, as adults, they continue to relive the childhood experiences that created the schema. When they encounter schema triggers, their emotional responses are disproportionate, and they experience their emotions fully and consciously.
The classic example of this is a person choosing a partner who treats them like a previous abuser did. Surrender represents a self-harm and a relinquishing of agency on the part of the patient. I want to suggest that the anti-Semitic schema would function a bit like this. You bathe yourself in all of your worst anxieties, and you project all of your own problems onto imagined Jews. Libidinal anti-Semitism, therefore, is not an unconscious decision like our tendency towards conspiracism. Anti-Semitism requires a level of self-awareness. Actually, wait. To show the logic of this, consider X. He's a silly little guy. Via our tendency to see patterns in clouds, we attempt to figure out why bad things happen without our involvement. Some problems, global neoliberalism, recessions, bad things happening, are difficult to conceptualize. Not because X is explicitly stupid, but because rational answers are often not emotionally satisfying enough for X, and complicated intersectional analysis is often very boring. If we are introduced to the idea of Jews controlling the world, this creates a much more exciting explanation for X. All of the world's evil, chaos, and sophistry are the result of one small group, not the global legacies of colonialism, wars, or interconnected conflicts. If we can vanquish that small group, then life will be alright. It is not necessarily an explanation that makes it easier to understand, but it is easier to use within the mind as a tool. Most people will grow out of these impulses once they learn about the Holocaust or the historic mistreatment of Jews, because they recognize that history is far more complicated than one small group simply destroying everything. X should recognize that this line of thinking leads to terrible things, and that it is nonsense that should be disregarded. But if X is exposed to anti-Semitism enough times, and that feeling he gets is much more emotionally satisfying than intersectional structural analysis, they grow accustomed to using Jews as an archetype to define themselves against. As X uses it more, it becomes a heuristic, and he delights in using the archetype to explain the world. It is more satisfying, although there is no tangible political or moral or social value to it. It is precisely because anti-Semites unconsciously feel bad for what they have done, whether it be harassment, violence, or even losing a close friend due to this behavior, that X developed an internal sunk cost fallacy, and over time, with enough burnt bridges and enough guilt in his soul, the anti-Semitic schema develops and colors every single choice that the anti-Semite makes. This is why Sartre's belief that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him is so profound, because it clearly states that anti-Semitism is an epistemic illness, one in which detaches the anti-Semite from reality itself, the reality of Jews being people, and filling the void with archetypes and symbols. Chapter 2. The Jewish Science. Non-derogatory. To further explore how the anti-Semitic schema develops and germinates, I feel it wise to discuss the field of psychoanalysis. We need to lay some groundwork before we do though, so lay upon your long couch, look up to the ceiling, and consider your feelings for your estranged mother. We may as well start with the fact of anti-Semites hating psychoanalysis, which they do because it was founded by Sigmund Freud, a secular Jew. Recall the example of anti-Semites hating Marxism because Marx was also born a Jew, even though Marxism is explicitly atheistic and Marx was outspoken about his distaste for Jews. It's the same line of logic. Thus, anti-Semites call psychoanalysis the Jewish science. So I'm not expecting to convince them if for some reason they're still watching this, but as Lipschitz says, we ought to pay no mind to these people because they have absolutely nothing useful to tell us about the practice of history or philosophy. Instead, they are useful case studies for how a human mind can go far beyond good taste and reason. Another problem with using psychoanalysis is that it is generally regarded to be a pseudoscience today. Freud is generally a contentious figure still within our times, and young people tend to call him a moron because of everything he got wrong, which, I mean, in my opinion, is tantamount to calling Aristotle a dum-dum just because he couldn't do science to our standards. The value of Freud's oeuvre is that it stoked the fires of conversation in his own time. He was provocative because the act of provocation created interesting answers. We must remember that Freud was one of the first popular scientists to regard women's emotions as valid, and he further exposed that violence and incest were actually at the heart of what was once called hysteria. Women aren't crazy, he posited. Men's violence is traumatizing them, actually. And even if Freud backed down due to a cowardly case of peer pressure, his work was the baseline for modern psychiatry. Psychoanalysis is Freud's school of thought, and even though it has a pseudoscientific connotations today, I would like to consider it as an interesting approach to studying the anti-Semitic mind for two reasons. Firstly, I prefer to view Freud as a philosopher of mind rather than a strict scientist. Freud believed that the psychoanalyst's job was to interpret their patient's issues, not dissimilar to like being an art critic. Thus, he was great at noticing human behavior, but due to the inherent lack of scientific rigor within his method, he was at times an awkward explainer. For instance, much of the inquiry into the psychology of women, even though he was one of the first to actually ask academically what women thought about their own minds, It is seen by modern feminists as dubious. This is because the fruits of these inquiries were rarely collaborative, leading to obtuse speculations of problematic quality. Considering all of this and acknowledging that it is an assault on science, it is nonetheless an intriguing school of philosophical thought, valuable because it takes irregular routes to reach compelling answers. Further, much of what Freud wrote about Jews was actually before the Holocaust, and that makes it even more interesting because after the war and his death, many people rediscovered his writings and found them to be quite topical. Secondly, Freud himself argued against the ideas of science being the only way to understand human behavior. Many of the early chapters of A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis speak about how scientists are ill-equipped to study the human mind because the pretense of rationality and objectivism are incompatible with the true nature of the human mind. The disregard for first-person experience is useful when trying to understand how intelligence works in a clinical sense, but Freud believed that this approach was not useful when it came time to treat his patients, which I believe to be pragmatic and good. At the same time, though, Freud was tremendously stubborn. In the middle chapters of his book focusing on dreams, he theorizes about the nature of unconscious drives, for example, men lusting after their sisters, and after receiving his patients' disgust and disagreement, he would rationalize their hostility away as if it were just an act of denial. Even if his reasoning was logically sound, it didn't mean it was valid because he allowed himself the space to say that he knew better than what his patients said because he was more objective than them. The contradiction between the liquid notion of objectivity and the blurring of the line between psychologist and philosopher are, in my opinion, what make people feel so uneasy about Freud. I still find his perspective to be useful though, especially in regard to antisemitism. Psychoanalyst Enver Falk, in his book on the topic, argues that it is impossible to objectively study irrational mindsets. To quote him directly,
psychoanalysis is threatening to historians who like to think that the choice of profession and methods of analysis are rational, indeed, that human behavior is rational, while the Holocaust itself is proof that it is not. Therefore, without a psychoanalytic investigation into the unconscious motives of the perpetration of the Holocaust, it is impossible to understand it fully.
I use this line of reasoning to argue that it is near essential to mention psychoanalysis somewhere when discussing antisemitism, because it itself is so ridiculous. It is impossible to logically debate someone out of a position that they did not logic themselves into, so you may as well look at their unconscious minds, because they have nothing poignant to say about their own nonsense. I want to say that I'm not an expert on psychoanalysis, and I am somewhat skeptical about some of the claims made. Thus, I will voice my opinions and objections where I deem them necessary. But if that is important to you, feel free to take what I have to say with a grain of salt. I am a student, and I am keen to learn more. This won't be a full-blown history of psychoanalysis. Instead, I'm going to focus on what they have to say about the inner psychology of anti-Semitism. I have to pause, once again, to express my thanks to my collaborator throughout this whole series, Emmett. When I couldn't find this book online for less than $200, they left their home in Boston and went to the W.E.B. Du Bois Library in Massachusetts University and hand-scanned the entire book for me. Can we get a thanks in the comments, please, for a they-them causing anti-fascist mayhem? Please. Okay, anyway. Anyone familiar with Freud will be aware of the Oedipus complex, which is sometimes misunderstood as lusting after one's mother. For our purposes, Freud was more interested in the power relations between father and son because he was kind of a sexist old man. The son consciously loves his father as his protector, but the son unconsciously hates the father because the father possesses the mother both her attention and her sexuality, and this hatred is a recognition of the son's own physical impotence. I find this idea to be better understood metaphorically rather than literally, because there are any number of retorts one could make. What if the son is gay? Or what if they're trans? Or what if the kid has two mums or two dads? Or what if they're all trans, and they all love each other, and they go to Italy, and they make a sandwich with a burly Italian man, and all four of them do the fingers, and they go, gabagool! What then? I think it's better to consider the Oedipus complex within the realm of archetypes. You know, the mother is the concept of nurture and life, and the father is the concept of protection and restriction. Cool. So it turns out that Freud thought the Oedipus complex to be the foremost unconscious drive behind anti-Semitism. According to his first crack at this, anti-Semitism was primarily about castration anxiety. Castration in psychoanalysis does not always mean that your penis will be trimmed, but rather it usually means that you will be emasculated, be made submissive, or otherwise be made to feel that you are impotent and powerless, right? But in this very specific case, Freud literally thought that anti-Semites hated Jews because they were circumcised. Which, I mean, I think is off base. Jewish men are not stereotyped as being hyper-masculine at the best of times. Anti-Semitism definitely has an element of sexual anxiety, as we will talk about in Chapter 4. But anti-Semites are too preoccupied calling Jews degenerate to worry about being sexually overpowered by them. Maybe if this is interpreted as the Jew will corrode the anti-Semite's masculinity by proxy, then it might make more sense, but it doesn't account for the fact that women can also be anti-Semitic. Gonna call this one bar humbug, chief. Freud's next assertion is more compelling. He observes that Jews worship the Father, God, and Christians worship the Son, Jesus. Because of this, Freud refers to Judaism as the father religion, and he posits that Judeophobes rejected Jews as proxy for the Father sacrificing Jesus for the sins of mankind. The poor Jewish people, who, with their habitual stubbornness, continued to disavow the Father's murder, atoned heavily for it within the course of time. They were constantly met with the reproach, "You killed our God Jesus Christ." And this reproach is true if correctly translated. If it is brought into relation with the history of religions, it runs, "You will not admit that you murdered God, the primal picture of God, the primal Father, and his later reincarnations." There should be a Christian edition declaring, "We did the same thing, to be sure, but we have admitted it, and since then, we have been absolved." When I analysed the story of Abraham and Isaac in the first episode, I left out one detail because I wanted to bring it up here. There is a base assumption to this myth, and that is that Christians identify more with Isaac and by proxy Jesus, while they assume that Jews actually identify with Abraham as the follower of God of the Old Testament. This enrages them because, as the scrawny guy Søren Kierkegaard eloquently pointed out, this myth is way more horrifying than it is noble. Faith comes before morality, and by identifying with Isaac, they disassociate themselves from the inherent fear of the story. But this is bad, plainly, because Jews also identify with Isaac. This is part of Abrahamic religion itself. You identify with Isaac and Jesus to understand the power of God's magnificence. It's scary that God is always right, and that fear has to be met with faith. That's the actual logic of the story, not that murdering your child is badass. A priori, Christians wanted to associate Jews with barbarism and human sacrifice, and that's why they claim they are closer to Abraham than Isaac, because Judaism to them is a father religion. Now, the theory of father and son religions connected to the Oedipus complex is speculative, to be sure, but it doesn't quite explain the breadth of the irrationality of anti-Semitism. With this as its foundation, hundreds of psychoanalysts built their church upon it, and Falk surveys the most interesting takes. I want to halt the momentum of this section just one last time to retort a potential critique that you may have. How are we supposed to regard psychoanalysis with any kind of academic weight when they've been wrong about social issues before? Freud, for instance, believed that being gay was due to a deviant pathology, whether it be poor parenting or fetishization. Something turned the kid gay, and it's a problem to be cured. So how can we trust psychoanalytic interpretations of anti-Semitism to also be not offensive, especially due to the speculative nature of it all? Which I think is an incredibly interesting point. As we've already observed, Freud believed that the job of the psychoanalyst was to interpret the patient's neurosis and prescribe creative solutions to curing said neurosis. The fact of the matter is that being gay is a natural thing. You are born that way, whereas anti-Semitism is a learned behavior. The association of how cool gay sex is with deviance, as Freud poignantly noted in his book, a conservative notion. To be deviant was not to follow strict homogenized Judeo-Christian social laws. Thus, the biases of the psychoanalyst and the society they existed in pathologized homosexuality. Part of interpreting the patient means comparing them to you. So I believe that, while the assertions of homosexuality are outdated and bad, the beliefs and arguments about anti-Semitic rambling are still relevant, precisely because they are discussed using the adjectives of learned behavior rather than medicalized pathology. Some of the claims made about Jews, like Freud's original belief of actual castration anxiety, are not convincing, but other assertions can be incredibly compelling, so we ought to be ready to critique these beliefs and not take them as gospel. With that in mind, I'm separating this chapter in half because we need to talk about Christian anti-Judaism and secular anti-Semitism separately. Okay, I'm going to try and do the rest of this part with a cat in my hands. It's going to be horrible. Anti-Judaism, as you will remember, is persecution on religious rather than racial grounds. As discussed throughout this series, Christians retold the story of Abraham and Isaac with the notion of resurrection. The Old Testament God is cruel for forcing his most devoted servant into sacrifice his son. But the Christian God is compassionate. The logic goes, so what if he killed Isaac? God would have resurrected him as he did Jesus. We've spoken about this notion of Christians feeling superior to Jews because our God is compassionate and all. But another interesting point is the idea of sacrifice. You will recall from episode 1 the notion of the blood libel, that Jews crucified little Christian boys to drink their blood, and more specifically to use their blood to make bread during Passover. And we talked briefly about how these medieval Christians projected their own guilt about child death onto Jews to justify pogroms. I want to return to the Christian projection and elaborate on it a bit here. Because as was demonstrated in that episode, although we might be secular today, we built Western society on the foundation of Christianity, and Christian Judeophobia did not evaporate once Nietzsche declared God to be dead. According to scholar of Jewish history Robert Wistrich, medieval peasants were preoccupied with these superstitions. This can be due to several reasons. You are gremlin! You can see her up there. Cat! We discussed the child murder angle back in episode 1, in which we looked at the outrageous claims that Jewish men menstruated, and thus they had to kill Christian boys to, quote, replenish themselves. These feelings were exacerbated by their belief that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ via them not letting Barabbas take Jesus' place. I got it right this time. Which of course is redundant since, say it with me now, the Romans killed Christ, not Jews. There is another angle here though, because when we consider the Oedipus complex in relation to all of these phenomena, we actually end up getting rich results, because Passover represents the escape from Egypt, and according to the book of Exodus, Jews put lamb's blood over their doorways to spare their children from God's punishment. God saved the children by warning their parents of the incoming plague, manufactured by God to free enslaved Jews. And not only are Jews not allowed to consume any kind of blood, but Passover is also intrinsically associated with animal rather than child sacrifice. By their very existence, the Jews, who had abandoned and condemned human sacrifice, became the unwitting accusers of the Christians who had sacrificed their Christ Jesus to their God, the Father, and by a perverse move of the Spirit, the Jews became the target of the sacrifice's unconscious projections of guilt feelings. Jesus was killed by his father, so intrinsically, Christianity hinges upon human sacrifice, and Christians have to treat their father as morally pure, so as a way to relieve this cognitive dissonance, they project onto Jews the guilt they themselves feel, and persecute Jews as much as they wish to persecute themselves. This is why they also have to tell themselves that Jews identify with Abraham and not Isaac, because otherwise, Christians would have to confront the great horror of Jews being not all that different from themselves. Christians had to claim that Jews devour blood, because if they did, it would be proof of improper worship, because the act of communion, of drinking the blood of Christ and eating his body as an act of worship every week, obviously has the implication of metaphorical cannibalism.
You're telling me that you believe that Christ comes back to life every Sunday in the form of a bowl of crackers, and then you proceed to just eat the man.
This act of faith, professing and exclaiming your faith in the Saviour, is then projected onto Jews in order to cleanse yourself of those guilty feelings. In Christianity as a son religion, the son has dethroned the father and done away with him, but the father has sacrificed, and owing allegiance now to the son, he suffers from survivor's guilt. Of course, the father could have also been killed by the son. In that case, the son projected his own guilt of deicide on the father, so that it appeared that the father killed the son. Then, the filicide was also designated as deicide. Since the Jew represents the father God, the guilt for filicide and for deicide, including the guilt for survival, are projected upon him as the Christ killer. Jew hatred is a pre-channelized generalization, which makes the individual feel important as the chosen victim of a conspiracy, the conspiracy of the Jews against Christ. Indoctrinated with the passion of Christ in early childhood, the individual empathized and identified with the seemingly helpless, persecuted, innocent Christ, and subsequently feels himself persecuted and threatened by the bad Jews. There is also another aspect of this projection to discuss. Christians and Jews share the Old Testament, and according to Falk, medieval Christians could not stand that. Freud himself hypothesized that anti-Judaism was in part caused by Christians projecting onto Jews everything they hated about Christianity. The rituals, the church sermons, the praying before bed. It all seems so archaic, so 1223, out of style. So they saw that Jews did some of these things as well. And since they hate Jews and they had an emotional incentive to not identify with them as fellow people of faith, they must attempt to discredit Judaism as a barbaric religion, one of drinking blood and with a cruel god at the helm. This cringing at their own piety is blatant self-hatred in the form of anti-Judaism. This is, I think, best explained by a controversial Jewish scholar named Maurice Samuel, a man who would most certainly get cancelled on Twitter today, but nonetheless I find his perspective to be interesting. As Falk explains,
The Christians unconsciously yearn for the freedom and license of the pagan world, but cannot attack their own religion. Instead, they unconsciously displace their rage to the Jews, the origin of Jesus Christ in Christianity. Were it not for the Jews, the Christians believe they would have remained happily pagan. They blame the Jews for having killed their Christ, which unconsciously they wish to do themselves. Like Freud, Samuel saw anti-Semitism as a product for the unconscious Oedipal complex, with the Jews unconsciously standing in for the father. This might remind you of that strange contradiction that we encountered back in episode 1, how Rome and the kings of old felt that they had to keep Jews around so that the Christian God could prove Jews wrong when the day of reckoning arrived. But these same kings felt that they had to control what their Jews did, lest they infringe on God's absolute power. We dismissed it as purely illogical back in episode 1, but I want to reconsider it in this context. But I believe now that the Christians felt burdened by Jews, by the prospect of being different and by not believing what everyone else in the village did. But they used these two differing beliefs, as modern anti-Semites do, to score points against Jews in different cases. The illogical nature of belief does not mean that there was no coherent reason as to why it existed in the first place. Anti-Judaism throughout history was no accident, and it was not based upon a whim. It has been used to control populations and consolidate political capital. As we discussed in episode 2, anti-Judaic arguments were reappropriated by anti-Semites. They couldn't blame Jews for the death of Christ anymore, but they used the same kinds of arguments on the basis of racial grounds. This secular notion treated science as faith, and faith that their dubious science was right eventually led to events like the Dreyfus Affair and the Holocaust. So you will likely catch many of the same kinds of arguments here because the emotional motivators are so similar. I want to start off with a spicy one. Let's discuss the Israel-Palestine conflict. I want to once again reiterate that it would take its own series to do it all justice, so I'm not going to take that much of a deep dive into it. But during the Second Palestinian Uprising of September of 2000, an 11-year-old Palestinian boy was killed by the Israeli military. It became world famous because a news crew caught the death on camera. And this is honestly a weird little rabbit hole to go down. The Israeli army initially accepted blame for the murder, then 3 weeks later they denied responsibility by claiming that the boy was killed by a stray bullet in the middle of a firefight between two armies, so who knows according to them? And even 13 years later, the Israeli defense minister claimed that the footage was a hoax, which seems dodgy on the face of it.
The report that's been published today says there's no evidence that this was the case, and says that the incident has become part of a poisonous blood libel, as it puts it, against the State of Israel.
Falk, as a pretty hardcore Zionist, writes about this event, and he observes that it was tragic and awful, but much of the backlash came at the behest of people from around the world blaming all of Israel and all Jews categorically for the death of this child, which is interesting to me. According to Falk, what transpired in the media was not a demand for justice and accountability. Instead, it was a desire to blame Jews for child murder, of which Europeans have quite the vocabulary for. The collective anti-Semitic fantasy of all the world's Jews being one huge collective entity, which is responsible for the American Zionist war in Iraq and Afghanistan, helps the anti-Semite imagine themselves as champions of pacifism, multilateralism, and solidarity with all victims of the world and the Jews as the traitors. It was like they had the moral high ground. A child died, and thus their feelings of moral righteousness justified in their own minds the use of anti-Semitic tropes. Just this once. As a treat. This is ludicrous, because it is not a demand for justice. If it were, critics would have assigned blame to the soldiers and the cops that terrorized the Palestinian people, and called for persecution of the soldiers who actually killed the child. Blaming all Jews around the world, or even all Jews in Israel for this, is a fallacy, because it assigns collective responsibility for something that only a few people did. All of this is not to absolve the soldiers of blame, but even if the leftists in my audience disagree, you have to admit that it's at least parallel to blaming all Jews for the death of Christ. And this is a fallacy that we must be careful of, because it's so easy to fall into anti-Semitic tropes when we talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Free Palestine. Moving on to another topic. Psychoanalysts are very interested in the notion of narcissism. If anti-Semitism is a point of self-definition, then you're constantly obsessed with yourself. It is worth keeping in mind that there is a terrible amount of narcissism and self-hatred, because time spent hating yourself is time spent thinking about your own importance, when, in reality, you just aren't that important in the first place.
Falk writes about anti-Semitism in Europe in the 1930s, and he writes that during the process of the Holocaust, Germans and Poles tried to remove Jewish, read religious, elements from their own country. And much like how Christians cringed at their own piety and projected their own shame and self-hatred onto Jews, modern Europeans turned this secular self-hating narcissism up to 11. To the anti-Semite, the Jew plays the unconscious role of a monstrous double, who must be destroyed if the anti-Semite is not to be overwhelmed by his own anxiety. The projection of one's own hated feelings and wishes is not enough. The monstrous double must be eliminated to gain relief from anxiety and depression. Nazi anti-Semitism was the fusion of two ambitions for universal empire. One imaginary, which is attributed to the Jews, and one caressed, that of Nazis themselves. After this quote, Falk goes on to compare these two ambitions to the Freudian idea of the bad breast, in which a baby despises his mother for giving him a breast that he deems to be bad, yucky milky, as it were. And this is meant to represent certain a priori assessments that were made unconsciously. Recall my Conspiracism video and the car anecdote in relation to System 1 and 2. It kind of works a bit like that. Now, not only do I personally think that the notion of the bad breast is silly, but I think this comparison here is misogynistic as hell. You know, the entire weight of the Holocaust and fascism laid upon mothers and the unconscious desires that they gave their anti-Semitic children. I should note that this book, even though it reads like a full literature review of the field, doesn't cite female psychoanalysts very often. We'll speak more about feminist psychoanalysis in chapter 4, but the concept of the monstrous double, self-hatred projected onto Jews, and the subsequent purging of this hatred via genocidal action is one that would be a very useful tool down the track. Since we're here, I feel it worthwhile bringing up the concept of the self-hating Jew.
You're a self-loathing Jew.
Am I?
Oh,
Well,
yes,
let me tell you
yes.
something. I do hate myself, but it has nothing to do with being Jewish.
A concept that I've been utterly deluged under with my research. You might be wondering why people like Marx or Freud distance themselves from their heritage. Well, Jews, generally Zionists, argue that this is because Jews simply hate themselves, and they project self-hatred onto the Jewish community as a whole. As someone who isn't Jewish, I don't think I should say too much about whether or not this is a fair assessment, but I do share similar sentiments to the late great anthropologist David Graeber.
One of the things I find most offensive is that I am a self-hating Jew if I am loyal to that tradition of Judaism which has produced such figures as Karl Marx, Baruch Spinoza, Jesus, all those Jewish heretics. Somehow all those guys are freaks, and Bibi Netanyahu represents my true soul. And if I don't like Bibi Netanyahu very much, I'm a self-hating Jew. I can't express how offensive I find that. Those people don't speak for me, and they don't speak for a majority of Jews worldwide. And the fact that they are taking our safety, our culture, our traditions, and using it as a weapon to fight against someone who wants to redistribute a little money so there aren't homeless people on the street, it's a deep, profound insult to the humanistic spirit which is at the core of Judaism. It is itself anti-Semitic.
Finally, before we move on to the next chapter, I want to give a psychoanalytic view of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, because there is one thing that I left out of my discussion that I wanted to speak about here, and that is how one of the scariest elements of the Protocols was how sublimely it dehumanized Jews. When you engage with fantasies of Jews secretly controlling the world, a concept of which you have no proof of, you lose contact with humanity. As Falk writes, the Protocols blurred the lines of whether Jews were a religion, a people, a nation, a race, or an ethnic group. They become reified, satanic, a cartoon reflection of an otherworldly evil. This cartoony nature is, of course, the point. The utility of framing your enemies as satanic is that it justifies whatever action you feel necessary to fight a metaphysical super evil. One of the psychological processes that enabled anti-Semites such as the German Nazis to murder Jews, as well as Roma, homosexuals, Slavs, and other inferior people, without feeling remorse, shame, guilt, or horror at their own actions, was the dehumanization and demonization. The killers had convinced themselves that the people they were killing were not human, that they were demons, monsters, or plague-bearing rats, and that they had to be exterminated in order to save the German nation, which was the Nazis' idealized mother. Falk further argues that the Protocols were themselves the perfect object in which to understand the anti-Semitic neurosis, believing in something that has been resolutely debunked dozens upon dozens of times by different academic sources. For anyone to seriously consider them with actual academic rigor would, according to him, literally have to be quote-unquote of schizophrenic mind. I would disagree with the last part. Aside from the ableism, folk assumes that anti-Semites value truth, and further that they believe their propaganda to be based upon observable fact. But as I have demonstrated, the anti-Semitic schema does away with truth altogether. Anti-Semitism rots the brain and destroys the value of truth itself, in place of emotionally satisfying archetypes that fill reality with nonsense. These processes might take place automatically, but the intellectual part of our mind can critique the impulses and readjust our mental course. The power of the great anti-Semitic heuristic is that it overrides the logical part of the brain by filling in illogical gaps with Jews instead of facts. This leaves the anti-Semite angry, afraid, and averse to change. It is miserable, but it works. The utility of anti-Semitism is such that it can justify fascist totalitarianism, a system that requires the enemy to be degenerate and yet powerful enough to threaten the nation. Truth left them behind a long time ago, because it stopped being relevant to their view of reality. So that raises the question, how does anti-Semitism work in groups? Gotta redo a page. Part 2, Sociology. In the last episode, I decided against giving a full history of the Third Reich because I do not possess the hubris to think that I could do that topic justice in the allocated space of a video essay all by myself. I want to return to fascist Germany for the duration of Chapter 3, but I thought I would slide something in that I forgot to mention in that episode. Something that on my part was a major oversight, and I only kind of realised it after I published it. You see, there was major controversy about Jewish asylum to the United States and abroad. The Nazis were terrorising Jews. No one cared enough to take refugees because they were Jewish. I used clips from Ken Burns' mini-series, The US and the Holocaust, and that goes in depth about the legislation around the event, and the crew even interviewed some of the refugees who were children at the time. The discourse around this event was covered extensively in Lawrence Rees's book, The Holocaust: A New History, where he details the Evian Conference, set up in wake of the Nuremberg Laws, where delegates from all around the world expressed sympathy for Jews, but not enough to take a sizable amount of them. Lest we pretend that this was an American phenomenon, Australia was there, and we didn't do shit. I'm gonna cancel Joseph Lyons, who, fun fact, started the United Australia Party. That's a joke purely for my Australian viewers. Actually, a heart attack is what cancelled Honest Joe. Regardless of my jokes, unknowable amounts of lives could have been saved. This was not mere apathy, this was compliance. They might not have known that the Holocaust was going to happen, back then in 1938, but they didn't care enough to care. Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic were pretty cool though. The Dominicans took an estimated 100,000 Jews, and the Costa Ricans took a similar amount. I don't really have a bit planned for that, I'm just like, yeah. Look at them go. Some Americans are alright. Sartre, psychoanalysis, nor maladaptive schema can explain that. So I want to broaden the scope of this part to explore how this compliance and apathy relates to Judaism, and how entire societies have just been fine to allow millions of Jews to suffer needlessly. Finally, there's going to be a lot of German words to pronounce henceforth. I do not speak German, I can't even pronounce English at the best of times, so I ask you to bear with me and mayhaps even partake in some mild schadenfreude at my ungainly pronunciation of Prussian vernacular. Chapter 3, L.T.I. We love an ominous chapter title. Victor Klemperer was a secular Jew in Nazi Germany. He was married to a Christian woman, and because the Nazis didn't want to legalize divorce, he was spared the full wrath of that regime. He didn't have an easy time though. He was barred from owning a car, and he was forced to retire from his job at Dresden University. Klemperer was a philologist by trade, which means that he was really interested in the philosophy of language. During the Nazi regime, he kept a secret daily diary, and he wrote down who he spoke to in the streets of Dresden and what he read in the papers that day. His diaries have been published in full, but I'm most interested in what is considered to be his masterwork, The Language of the Third Reich, Lingua Tertii Imperii in Latin, L.T.I. This book is genuinely quite difficult to read. The sweet spot for me as a creator is to read a book and have the author say, X contains free properties, and then I can use the free properties of X to aid in my analysis. I do this so often in my work that you could honestly make a drinking game out of it. But because of the serialized nature of Klemperer's work, instead of 3 major properties, he gives you a spider's web. Each strand is an example of a word, which is part of the larger web. And he didn't write like this because he was a bad writer, mind you, because he was about as terrific as he'd hope a philologist to be. But because his subject matter was so complicated that it couldn't just be summarized by using X. L.T.I, as best as I can surmise, is the internal logic of Nazi fascism. I can imagine someone groaning here, comparing all anti-Semites to Nazis. It's a bit redundant, is it not? And I think that's somewhat fair. You know, Nazis have been vilified to the point of being cartoonish, and this can diminish what made their ideology so repugnant. Political philosopher and philologist Jason Stanley has written much about how propaganda works in his book, How Propaganda Works. He discusses how fascism is quite literally a flawed ideology. Like, say what you will about capitalism and communism, they have an internal logic to reckon with. The market is just, the proles are suppressed. Fascism is dangerous precisely because it does away with truth and reality altogether. He describes how fascism works in his book, How Fascism Works. What's the next book going to be about? How language works? Close enough. The top of the hierarchy must consist of us, and the bottom are them. It is the natural order of things, and fascists saw the hierarchies of the early 20th century as unfair because they were marginally egalitarian. Thus, they attempt to frame themselves as defensives, seeking to put things back in its rightful place. Because of this, they have to contort reality to fix what was broken by an ill-defined boogeyman. Fascists despise democracy because it allows human beings they deem degenerate to have as much of a say as they do. The purpose of fascist propaganda, then, is to return the world to a vague sense of the nostalgic past, a world that likely never existed, and fascists use that notion to make themselves feel more important in the grander scheme than they actually are. Klemperer has this great metaphor that he uses to explain the subjective quality of fascism, and I imagine that it inspired Stanley greatly. Victor writes about the history of modern art, and the 2 movements of Impressionism and Expressionism. Impressionism focuses on emulating reality. The Impressionist tries to paint her subject as she and others see them. There is an emphasis on spontaneity and subdued colours. For example, the paintings of Claude Monet relish things of this world: flowers, bridges, gal pals sitting in the park. Contrastingly, Expressionism is all about indulging in subjectivity, painting the world as you personally wish to see it. Consider Van Gogh taking his epilepsy medicine, taking a swig of his turpentine, and subsequently seeing a starry night. Expressionists favour distorted forms, surreal landscapes, and colours that go whoosh. One artist imposes her impression of the subject, and the other expresses her perception of the subject. Klemperer goes on to write, the L.T.I either inherits from the Expressionists, or it shares with them certain ways of expressing the importance of the will and a fervently thrusting forward momentum. Concluding that he personally has no faith in so-called purely aesthetic observations about the practice of history and knowledge, because they are expressions of reality rather than honest assessments. So let's get the obvious critique out of the way, like the first thing that you'd likely thought of. Klemperer is not saying that subjective art is morally worse than Impressionism, or that whooshy colours lead to fascism. He's quite adamant about that in his book. Instead, he uses these movements to describe how politicians viewed their own reality, and he tries to give a possible explanation as to how people arrived at fascism in the first place. I argue that this concept is extremely important to understand the logic of anti-Semitic schemas, because the Nazis mastered anti-Semitic propaganda, and much of the modern cliches and tropes of Judeophobia are underlaid by the L.T.I now. I've done my best to distill Klemperer's work for comprehensibility's sake. Note that there is so much more to talk about than what I will, but in essence, L.T.I has 3 broad characteristics, and they overlap with one another. It constricts thought, it crafts ironic innuendo, and it inoculates resentment. The rest of this chapter will explore these phenomena. Whoa! God damn. Fascism is about the big picture, the invention of the past and the quest for the future. The present only matters insofar as it advances one of these. Klemperer was interested in how the German word for historic became overused to the point of becoming meaningless. The regime took itself so seriously that the very importance of its own institutions and every event that took place within them was worthy of the history books. Every speech given by the Führer is historical, even if he says the same thing 100 times over. The victory of a German racing car is historical, as is the official opening of a new motorway, and every single road,
and every single section of every road is officially inaugurated. Every harvest festival is historical, every party rally, every feast day of any kind, and since the Third Reich seems to know nothing but feast days, you could say that it suffered, indeed that it was mortally ill, from a lack of everydays. Just as a human body can be mortally ill from a lack of salt, it views every day of its life as historical.
Nothing the party did was mundane, and the significance of this is that if every action is sublime and remarkable, then nothing is worthy of critique because it's all going down in history. Don't think. Experience a once-in-a-lifetime event every Tuesday. The lack of normalcy in human life, though, led to a soul sickness and exhaustion that was sublimated into attacking the outgroup. The first word that Klemperer noticed as being specifically German fascist was the term Strafexpedition, which is an abbreviation of punitive action. Punitive, of course, evokes the Punic Wars of the Romans against the Carthaginians. It connotes barbarism and the hordes beyond the gates. Klemperer was bewildered about how punitive action became seen by the Nazis as a virtue. He writes about a lad that he used to board. This man had ambitions in the military, and over time he took on more Nazi propaganda. This man described the punitive action that he partook in when attacking communist subversives as shameless fun, some tomfoolery with his unit. This ruthless, violent, and arrogant justness in his own cause is described by Klemperer as broadly colonial, something that can only be explained by a foreign occupation of sense. There is no logical reason as to how arrogant violence could be described as a virtue, and it's because it's the first step of the process of normalization. Punitive action over the course of 60 years became state-sanctioned protections against Jews and subversives. It is an honor to protect the state against those who wish to undermine her, because each and every blow is historical, and by golly if it isn't fun to partake in history. Both of these impulses are symptoms of another favourite term of the Nazis. The German word Aufsein originally meant to mount or to set up, but over time it turned into something closer to winding up. Members of the party were set up to follow the leader, as Klemperer writes, and because an unthinking loyalty to the state was seen as a necessity for fascism to function, to be seen as an automaton became one of the greatest virtues a person could hold. This is because a loyal party member is set up to be impressive and ethical. There is another German word called Gemut. It doesn't really have an English equivalent, but it denotes a social virtue, the ability to be part of a team. And two of these terms became two parts of the same thing. To be a good party member was to do as you were told, and to be good meant that you had to get along with your comrades and your superiors. This cycles into infinity, and we have the kind of obedience that sees punitive action as a wholesome pastime. The consistent distortion served a greater purpose as well. As Klemperer writes in a fittingly cynical tone, the Germanization of fascist language and cliches led to words with difficult to comprehend meanings. Punitive action became organized protection. The roadworks down the way are historical somehow. Normal becomes exceptional, and exceptional times call for exceptional measures. The purpose of this innuendo is to shape thought into convenient pathways, and there are two requirements for the simple heuristic to take place. You have to have the perfect party, unable to be beaten and divinely moral, and you have to have an insurmountable evil. Antisemitism takes care of the former with its dialectic liquidity, and according to Klemperer, the latter is satisfied by contradictory propaganda messages.
What Hitler invariably knows frighteningly well, and exploits to his advantage, is the psyche of the unthinking masses, who are to be kept from thinking at all costs. A foreign word impresses all the more the less it is understood. In not being comprehended, it confuses and stupefies, and, in addition, drowns out thought.
Reality itself is complicated, the party says, and this is because of Jewish interference. In order to simplify reality and to comprehend your own place within history, you just need to have faith in the party, because only they can express reality, like a turpentine-fueled starry night. Klemperer writes about the defensive character of Nazism by describing the use of the verb Coventarian. Derived from the English Coventry, an armory storeroom, Klemperer writes about how this word that once denoted defense and inactivity was twisted into a term about overreaction and cruelty.
Because, on principle, we only attacked what in every report was referred to as military targets, for we also only engaged in retaliation had certainly not started anything, in contrast to the English who had started the air raids and who, as pirates of the air, mainly directed them at churches and hospitals. German bombers, therefore, razed Coventry to the ground and were now threatening to Coventryize every English town since they all served military ends. So to Coventryize was to frame your enemy's offense as overkill, underhanded, attacking a man only after he takes his armor off. You were minding your own business, and a great wrong was done against you. When you frame your enemy in this way, as pirates and gangsters that the Nazis often did, and you claim that they are detached from the bounds of morality, any response that you take will seem quaint in comparison. Further, if you can claim that the enemy started the violence, no matter how far you take it, the violence you inflict will be reactionary. Punitive violence becomes retaliation, self-justifying, and this sense of responding to unfairness, to persecution, is core to the fascist mindset. The Nazi sees himself as defending the motherland from the perverse violence of the enemy seeking to undermine it. We will discuss this tendency at length later, put a pin in it, but this defensive innuendo serves to justify terrible violence. You might have killed an entire family of Jewish communists with your gun, but they started it by aiming to destroy whiteness itself. Your actions are, in your mind, a fair, if mild, retaliation. This innuendo, that all enemies of the party started the violence the party is now partaking in, is insidious. There is no horror that you could unleash that would entirely pay the enemy back for the supposed underhandedness. And when we consider this along the lines of dehumanization, it becomes incredibly easy to do terrible things. As the Reich started losing the war on all fronts, and the Holocaust went into overdrive, bands of citizen soldiers started popping up around Dresden. As Klemperer writes, the remnants of the Gestapo and the military police went around the city with Volksschandeling Bekämpfer on their arms. It was an organization made to capture military deserters and citizens dodging the military draft. Even though the state was failing and the military was falling apart at the seams, these individuals were degenerate, Jewish, they lacked Gemut and they were letting their motherland down. Because that was so immoral in that society, the violent bands of armed thug framed themselves as a service to the populace at large, hunting strays and reforming their wrong ways. Dissenters have lost faith in the party, and as Coventry action, they had to eliminate said dissent. This manipulation of innuendo to shield the soldier from shame also works in another way. Klemperer relays a story a hairdresser once told him. One day, a Jewish woman walked in and asked for a haircut. He refused to serve her, saying that he was not allowed to. When she asked why, he said that he had heard Hitler proclaim on the radio that, during the boycotts of Jewish-owned stores, he promised that no one was to harm a single hair on a Jew's head. This man relayed this story to Klemperer as a joke, saying that this man was in hysterics afterward, clapping and laughing for an uncomfortably long time. So, the hairdresser was not sincerely afraid for his business's well-being, nor was this a moment of hypocrisy. Instead, it was a gotcha. He was pretending to abide by the law while hundreds of Jewish stores around them were being looted, damaged, and the owners were threatened with actual punitive action. He did not seriously believe what he said. He was performing his own brand of violence and disregard for his fellow human beings. When the state invents innuendos like this, they are not meant to be followed to the letter. They are supposed to be twisted into whatever hurts subversives the most. Okay, right. Fascists are on a team, and anything that scores a point is just, and anything that doesn't is immoral. This knowingly nasty irony is a definitive characteristic of fascism. And recall how the Nazis admired the Americans for their miscegenation laws, which were detached from reason and proudly unfair. On a similar note, Klemperer observes the Nazi motif of what he calls ironic quotation marks. Klemperer gives the example of Albert Einstein successfully immigrating to the United States to escape persecution. The newspapers reported that Albert Einstein was a research scientist, implying that his research was nonsense and that they're glad a Jewish intellectual is gone from their country. These ironic quotation marks portray a doublethink, because to the uninformed observer, this was a sincere report. A research scientist has moved to another country. But under the guise of irony, you can imply any number of things. The reporter knows it, the reader knows it, but it would be hard to prove it in a court of law that this irony exists because the text doesn't explicitly say anything hateful. There's a layer of deniability.
The slaughter of Russian civilians, says Klemperer, was reported as the death of Red General Staff. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt have landed at Omaha Beach. Well, they are simply statesmen who are nothing in comparison to the glory of the party. We will discuss this more at length later in this chapter because Nazis still use this trick today, introducing dog whistles into the lexicon to harm Jews, but as an outside observer without context, the Jew just seems hysterical over the image of a cartoon frog. Let's pull that pin out now. The idea of Coventry as defensive retaliation rather than blatant and unjustifiable violence also runs under a similar logic. The defensive framing is blatantly ironic, but it's experienced as sincere because it is a good emotional excuse to justify violence. It isn't hypocrisy because hypocrisy relies upon the agent in question being unaware of this irony. Fascists relish the ironic ambiguity of their actions because they can use it to harm people, and then they can hide behind the excuse of ignorance if it doesn't work out. It works on two different levels, and that's why it's so effective. From the previous episode, the Holocaust deniers claiming that they are simply revisionists has a cloud of irony to it. They know they are lying, but the layperson can't easily prove that they are. This pretense of irony suppresses guilt and allows the perpetrator to enjoy the pain he inflicts on others. This ironic character to fascist persecution is used in the sublimation of guilt. You turn an ego-wounding feature into something you perceive as more positive. The archetypes of the greedy banker and the lustful Jew are the result of a most absurd projection. You exist within a social system that demands that you take it divinely serious when the theatrics of fascism are objectively silly, and yet they demand that you use irony to persecute the enemy. You can't be 100% sincere or 100% ironic in your belief. You feel all of these guilty feelings, and you're lost in a bath of irony, and then you project all of that emotional turmoil onto Jews. You imagine that they are the ones who are poisoned by avarice and pretense, foaming at the mouth to undermine the white race and plotting ways to steal your wife and indoctrinate your children. Which, of course, no such thing is happening, and you're planning on doing that very same thing. The invocation is designed to inoculate resentment because, it's one thing to have an enemy in which you engage with passively. You might dislike how Australia Post are slow and they misplaced a book that you ordered. But this is an annoyance. You aren't angry enough to campaign against it. But when you inoculate resentment in someone, your anger motivates you to want to change things. Klemperer discusses how the word ghetto was used in such a manner. As abandoned parts of town became more frequent across the country due to Jews being sent to gas chambers, Aryan Germans were able to move into these empty houses where things were nicer than theirs, and this entitlement to property fostered resentment for their fellow citizens, both Aryan and Jewish. Consider how this is dramatized in the film 1945, where the townsfolk bicker amongst themselves about property they stole. Great movie, watch it. We have discussed how this resentment worked for those within the party, but as Klemperer writes, this was also ruinously effective within the Jewish community itself. People forced into ghettos grew resentment towards those with whom they shared houses with. A sense of relative privilege was built and directed unconscious resentment for the state as a whole onto those of whom you were around. A Nazi might say, my neighbor is privileged, he didn't even have to move into a Jewish house. And a Jew could say, how privileged that man is over there, he doesn't have to wear the star on his arm. Toxic feelings of envy were fostered to misdirect feelings of persecution, and this further fueled the fires of antisemitism and trust in the party. This was an incredible situation, and all of these phenomena could not be accounted for, as Klemperer admits. This is the only invention by the Nazis where I am not certain whether the authors were fully aware of the diabolic nature of their contrivance. The privileged only existed amongst groups of Jewish factory workers. The preferential treatment they received consisted of not having to wear the star or live in a Jew's house. Perhaps this section, in which action repeatedly led to the inequalities and grotesque hair-splitting, was really only created in order to protect sections of the population deemed useful to the Nazis. But in practice, nothing was more divisive or demoralizing for the Jewish population than this regulation. All the worst characteristics of people come to light here. It's enough to make you an anti-Semite. I love that last quote because it's so funny and yet absolutely terrifying. You know, the manufactured cruelties of the ghettos were enough to drive a sane person mad enough to sympathize with the people who put him there. This entitlement to property manifests in one more way that Klemperer only implies, but is actually said by Enver Folk. Because much of this resentment, envy, and malice towards your fellow citizenship was because of a lack of money that everyone had. Totalitarian regimes only care about staying in power, so they dedicate all of their resources to maintaining themselves, and the Volk are only important as a resource. So during a shortage in everything, everyone has to go hungry. And because of the ludicrous historical stereotypes of Jews and money, the regime managed to blame the state of affairs onto Jews themselves. The antisemites view the Jewish question, itself an ironic term, it ain't a question, as a socio-economic issue, even though there are very few Jews who have ever had very much. As with most people throughout history, Folk reviews the work of a Marxist psychoanalyst and concludes, the author saw a connection between the social passage of the marginal pre-capitalist anti-Semitism to the universal modern kind of economic universalization of the production of goods and exchange value in the world of goods and services. Clausen believed that historically, Jew and value were experienced as identical in developed capitalism. He thought that the universalization of the production of goods and exchange value remains unacknowledged, while instead the fetishism of goods and anti-Semitism comes to light as a false consciousness. At the heart of anti-Semitism, you have this dance between sincere hatred and ironic detachment. You feel sincere feelings of hatred and resentment. Your libidinal schema says that all Jews are responsible for all that you find to be wrong. But in your heart of hearts, you recognize that there is no concrete evidence or credible sources to justify these feelings. So you sublimate these irrational and passionate feelings into a very nasty irony. You know it's wrong, but it's funny when you demean them. The dialectic liquidity of the imagined Jew is knowingly ironic. They are degenerate, but they are powerful enough to control the world. It doesn't cohere into something tangible, and this forces the anti-Semite to seek out irrational spaces where they don't have to check their beliefs at the door. The function of the L.T.I. was to homogenize extremist opinions, to the point that it just became unremarkable to the average citizen. Holocaust historian Lawrence Rees writes about how the Nuremberg laws were seen by ordinary German citizens as a bit Nazi? Good job, Angus, language man over here. Writes about how the Nuremberg laws were seen by the ordinary German as a bit nasty, but they went along with them because these laws regulated cruelty. To paraphrase him, the laws created the rules, and in the mind of unaffected citizens, they protected Jews from arbitrary violence. An eye for an eye, but no more than an eye. As if German Jews deserved what happened to them. The power of the L.T.I. was such that it put anti-Semitic self-definition at the forefront of its propaganda campaigns. To quote the esteemed political philosopher Hannah Arendt, it's upside down. The Nazis placed the Jewish issue at the center of their propaganda, in the sense that anti-Semitism was no longer a question of opinions about people different from the majority, or a concern of national politics, but the intimate concern of every individual in his personal existence. Nazi propaganda was ingenious enough to transform anti-Semitism into a principle of self-definition, and thus to eliminate it from the fluctuations of mere opinion. It used the persuasions of mass demagogy only as a preparatory step, and never overestimated its lasting influence, whether it be in oratory or in print. This gave the masses of atomized, undefinable, unstable, and futile individuals a means of self-definition and identification, which only restored some of the self-respect they had formerly derived from their function in society, but also created a kind of spurious stability which made them better candidates for an organization. I used that quote in my Port Arthur series, and I hope that it's gained a new meaning, and it's been fleshed out more now that we have 7 more hours of context. The Holocaust proved that self-definition was such a powerful strategy to control people that the Nazis killed 6 million Jews. For that is the internal logic of the L.T.I. Whatever hurts Jews the most is true, because it justifies everything that we have done. Chapter 4, The Process of Making Unhappened. Anti-Semitism grows more pervasive by the year. At the end of history, and as the Holocaust fades from lived memory, we lose the power of the emotions that resisted fascism, and with that, we grow more ignorant of the pain that it caused. Along with the Dreyfus Affair and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Holocaust denial is the final defining characteristic of modern anti-Semitism. Jew hatred, dubiously backed up by dodgy science and a hazy defensive anxiety about the machinations of global banking, is quite a complex force in the human psyche. It is also important to remember that the eugenics that inspired the Nazis was not solely aimed towards Jews. It was used to oppress all peoples of colour and suppress women's rights. An anti-Semite is not a Jew hater alone, he's often also a sexist, a racist, and a homophobic transphobe. Thus, to understand the anatomy of anti-Semitism further, we need to explore how it intersects with other types of bigotry. Elizabeth Young Bruhl was Hannah Arendt's mentee. That's the word for, opposite of mentor. She wrote her biography and later used her broad knowledge of political philosophy, sociology, and psychoanalysis to write the fantastic The Anatomy of Prejudices. This book is ambitious in scope, and it aims to give a definitive history and commentary on bigotry in the 20th century. And over the course of its 550 pages, she succeeds with an astounding tact and wit. Her book divides prejudice into three broad categories. We have sex-based prejudices, which encompass women, gay, and trans people. And then we have colonial prejudice, which focuses on African, Asian, and indigenous racisms. And then finally we have a broad analysis of anti-Semitism. All of these intersect with one another in a myriad of ways, and Young Bruhl's thesis... It's really ungainly to have... I'm not calling her Young, that's just her name. I promise I'm not a greasy tradie. Young Bruhl's thesis is that these so-called ideologies of desire cannot be understood by themselves, so her analysis often contrasts anti-Semitism to sexism because Jewish women are treated differently to Jewish men. So, I'm planning on discussing each of these ideologies of desire and returning to anti-Semitism with a new vocabulary and a new understanding of its intersectional nature. Let's start with how these ideologies of desire work. The central motivator of all of these is that these ideologies function under the guise of backlash against equality. They are implicitly regressive movements that seek to return the world to a time before calls of equality. Thus, these ideologies of desire frame themselves as defensive rather than offensive. The anti-Semite doesn't say that we ought to attack Jews for the hell of it. They frame themselves as concerned citizens, worried about how Jews seek to control the West itself. Framing yourself as a victim fosters righteousness and dampens any feelings of guilt one might feel in the back of their minds. It is also worth noting here that Bruhl assumes that the backlasher in most cases is a cis white man. This is based on the realities of white supremacist patriarchy and the inherent power relations that entails. Obviously, black men can be sexist, white women can be racist, and both of them can be anti-Semitic. But for simplicity's sake, we will follow this assumption because otherwise this chapter would have to be twice as long as it already is. So these ideologies of desire are defined by three major characteristics. The backlash of the narcissist aims to enforce gendered norms. The narcissist is generally someone who sees himself as an anatomical default, and thus anyone who is different from them is perverting society. Elizabeth describes the narcissist's fear of feminism as a type of castration anxiety. If women are autonomous, then the narcissist fears that they will become inadequate. The reliance on women to exist within gendered norms is what sustains their masculinity. This prejudice then is about domination and conformity to gender norms. Bruhl also counters the notion of penis envy, in which little girls feel impotence at their realization that they do not have a penis, an idea that I have nothing but contempt for, with the notion of womb envy, where cis men feel envious that they cannot create life, thus they feel compelled to control female autonomy as proxy for the creation of life. It's not a perfect analogy, cis men are still sexist to infertile, menopausal, and trans women after all. But with these two concepts, Young Bruhl demonstrates that sexism is a prejudice that demands passivity and submissiveness from women, whereas the homophobias are focused on the contempt for action. She distinguishes between the both of these as one-sex and two-sex sexism. The homophobias are similarly focused on the myth of bioessentialism, where sexual relations are purely procreative and aligned to divine intention. Thus, anyone who is cool enough to have gay sex is believed to be actively defying the state of nature. Liz doesn't bring up transphobia much in her book, which is a shame because it would have made her analysis even more interesting. It's worth noting that ContraPoints uses the anatomy of prejudices to explain transphobia in her videos on the subject. Either due to ignorance or disinterest, she only mentions the existence of transphobia in passing. The wrath of the narcissist is a toxic anxiety. If women can date other women, then men will become obsolete. And since the narcissist derives value from their ability to oppress women, they must be militant against homosexuality. Which man is supposed to oppress the other man in the gay-male relationship, they ask? The narcissistic prejudice then focuses on boundary establishment and genital intactness. They are unwilling to accept that people who aren't other cis straight men can live in different ways because that infringes on the narcissist's value for himself and his role in society.
Narcissistic characters want to love according to their images of perfect love, and they want to be loved according to their images of perfect loving, which they did not have, and which they fear the analytic situation will not provide. Self-awareness of toxic traits is itself a threat to the natural state of things. Consider how idiot baby men speak about the term toxic masculinity, because they believe that we believe that being a man is in and of itself a threat. The backlash of the hysteric, in contrast, is broadly colonial. Instead of being explicit patriarchy, it is white supremacy and the hierarchy of the races. It is similarly obsessed with sexual norms, but what characterizes the hysterical patient is an over-reliance on projection. Most of Bruhl's examples assume that the person of color is black and male rather than Asian or female, as masculinity and sexual insecurity are at the core of the hysteric neurosis. They imagine black men desiring white women, having his way with her, and this belief takes on a hysterical quality, detached from the nature of reality. Or rather, it becomes a hysterical crafted value. Consider the broad proliferation and popularity of interracial pornography, and how it is quite popular amongst racist demographics who are against miscegenation. I am not saying that interracial pornography is inherently racist. It is two people making love and / or mechanically exchanging fluids, but it isn't entirely value neutral or contextless either. For our purposes, the hysteric fetishizes, and in his act of consuming, he exercises his internal insecurity. Elizabeth sees this as an absurd projection. The hysteric character in his own narcissism fantasizes about assaulting women, and then he projects all of his worst fantasies onto the man of color, further justifying his belief that he is dangerous. This is often characterized by the obsession of the black phallus and the racist preoccupation with actual castration, itself a projection over the fact that white men lust after black women and have historically exploited and assaulted them repeatedly. Projection is much easier to do when you've already imagined doing the action. It takes one to know one. Elizabeth's analysis is referred to as colonial because the hysteric character always sees himself as superior to the object of their hysterics. It is crucial to them that the object of their scorn is of lower caste to them because that's how their projection works. The hysteric has to feel superior because it separates them from their own lust and sexual fantasy. A hysteric's own shame is cast onto a lower version of themselves, a monstrous double. The man of color is someone who cannot control themselves, they hysterically insist, because they lack self-awareness and thus they must be controlled to protect white women at large. Hysterical characters give the impression of play acting, being theatrical, because they are not able to gauge their feelings or say how they do feel, although they experience themselves as bundles of feelings. The emotions that seem to take possession of the hysterical are sometimes split off and assigned by them to another self, another half. The racist is hysterical because they are focused on things that do not occur. This is not to say that racism is solely sexual, because white supremacy itself is not solely sexual. Instead, the construction of the racist stereotypes and the theatrical performance of protection, rather than the enforcement of gendered norms, is at the forefront of the hysterical mind. Finally, the backlash of the obsessive focuses on antisemitism alone. Elizabeth is at pains to express that there are major elements of narcissism and hysterics in anti-Semitic rhetoric. Anti-Semites view male Jews as emasculated, and thus they want to police their masculinity. At the same time, they fret over Jews lusting after white women. This is point scoring rather than coherent ideology. But the scope of the obsessive character requires it to have its own category. After all, anti-Semitism is not just a racism, it's classism, theological persecution, collective responsibility, biological determinism, bizarre projection, backlash against capitalism, and racism all at the same time. This is why I describe this as a schema, because anti-Semitism is a church window in which you view a distorted and discolored reality. The scope of this leads the patient to become overwhelmed by their expression of things. Thus, they obsessively try to simplify reality. Recall the notion of the party being the only ones who have the ability to decipher their own worldview. Jews seem to be everywhere all at once, even when they aren't there. And this goes deeper than the notion of the hysteric projection, because anti-Semites believe that Jews control the world, even as there is no observable proof or truth to this claim. Where the hysteric crafts elaborate sexual fantasies about the man of color, the obsessive tries to nullify reality itself.
There is a cognitive dissonance between believing and seeing, and rather than disregarding that irrationality, the anti-Semitic schema pleads for the anti-Semite to disregard reality altogether. The very fact of there being no observable proof of Jews controlling the world and lusting after white women thus becomes proof of how sneaky and all-encompassing Jewish activity actually is. Freud had the fondness for the word Ungescheinmaten, which in English translates to making unhappened. He used this in the context of patients who are unwilling to accept their unconscious desires. Brawl explains that the concept of making unhappened is essentially the practice of unexplaining reality. More than simply ignoring the past, this defense magically eliminates it, leaving a blank in memory. The equivalent social mechanism of defense would eliminate a people from the historical record, either by physically eliminating them or by destroying their history, or both. Similarly, isolating means severing a happening from any emotion connected with it, cutting any ties it has to associations and, as it were, dropping it off in mental space, so that it does not enter into thought process. Out of sight, out of mind. And so it generates no emotion in memory. In the current form of anti-Semitism, like the denial of the reality of the Holocaust, a form of undoing, it is the very history of anti-Semitism itself that is being denied. Where the narcissist ignores the needs of others, and the hysteric tries to control and fetishize human behavior, the obsessive character is defined by their quest to unexplain the world. It is not that anti-Semites are ignorant to the legacy of usury, or that they are ignorant to the Romans killing Christ. It is that the schemas that they have developed have no use for such tangible explanations of the world, so they disregard reality to express what they want to be true. To me, this is a liberatingly useful explanation. We have explored throughout this series at length the ways in which anti-Semites use Jews to define what they are against, and with this as a tool, we can see that the dialectic liquidity of the imagined Jew is not an accident that just so happened to be tactically useful. It was the very point of their belief. In unexplaining, the anti-Semite sublimates their existential anxiety about how the world works into something that casts them as the victim, and the amorphous Jew as the all-encompassing villain. The creation is done to justify all matters of cruelty, Coventry. So let's look at an obscure example to demonstrate how this works. There is a TED Talk that's always stuck in my brain. A reformed neo-Nazi describes the first interaction he had with a skinhead, in which the Nazi walked up to him and snatched the joint from his hand and said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." Now, there's no observable proof about either of these things being true. The Soviet Union was iffy about the use of cannabis, even though hemp plants have been used to make rope for millennia in Slavic countries, and Israel only allows medicinal use of cannabis. I mean, that could be wrong, but I feel like if I went on Wikipedia to research this and that it was that ambiguous, there definitely isn't proof of global conspiracy. Instead, what this recruiter assigned to cannabis is that it's evil, and thus Jews must have made it because they are the originators of evil. The recruiter cares not for the historic use of cannabis to disproportionately imprison black Americans, which will become extra heinous in just a moment, but because the story he is selling to this kid was that he is being controlled without his knowledge. He unexplains reality to lure him in. What this does is frame the anti-Semite as virginal, innocent, and uncorrupted, and all of those who disagree with them are actively trying to ruin and destroy them. The act of belief, no matter how irrational, is an act of resistance. With that out of the way, let's talk about cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is defined as a conspiracy theory that posits that the small cabal of powerful degenerates want to destroy Western civilization with feminism, civil rights, and communism. It is seriously worth noting that this fascist conspiracy theory was brought back into popularity by a Norwegian Nazi who killed 77 people in Oslo and Utøya in 2011. He wrote about it in his manifesto, and it surged in popularity after 2011 online. We have discussed in episode 3 how anti-Semites associated Jews with communism, and we have already discussed how degenerate qualities were slapped onto progressive movements as a solid excuse to dismiss them. This base assumption, as a kind of schema, further infiltrates beliefs involving feminism, gay rights, and race equality. It isn't coherent, as there are plenty of disagreements and conflicts amongst all of these groups, but there is a kind of emotional logic to it all. Cultural Marxism is a catch-all term for "I don't like this because it's degenerate," and since conception, the term cultural Marxism has more often than not just been a dog whistle for Jews. The West, as an amorphous and confusing concept as it is, becomes primarily associated with whiteness and maleness, rather than democracy, human rights, or capitalism. They do not care if what they are saying is true, because they are unexplaining reality and crafting a world in which they are the true victims. Anything seen as an attempt to subvert the West is labelled as degenerate. Thus, feminism's belief that there should be equality in gender and sexuality is cultural Marxism. Systemic critique itself is cultural Marxism because it tries to change the status quo. The big question here is this: why were Jews picked for this exactly? If that isn't the specific inquiry of this whole series, the answer is this: why not Jews? They've already been associated with degeneracy for hundreds and hundreds of years. The answer to why Jews is always why not. It has always been this way. It is the Western tradition. In the obsessional mode of prejudice, the aggressors are a problem, and a solution for the problem must be found. The matter is intellectually set up, set out. The enemy people must represent or carry penetrating impulses or stricture, and they must be gotten rid of. The obsessional gets rid of them in thought by types of thinking or intellectual modes of defense, in matters of which are later, if social and political conditions encourage it and leaders like Hitler articulate it as a political ideology, is translated into action. Cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic rhetorical strategy, a way to put someone into a box and disregard their arguments because the box is labelled degenerate. But it is just a strategy, not the entire purpose behind the question why Jews want to subvert the West. Cultural Marxism, then, can be used to explain another core assumption of the narcissistic, the hysteric, and the obsessive patient. Because the most interesting thing about antisemitism in the Holocaust's wake was that it was the first time in history that anti-Semitic rambling itself was met with immediate and forceful condemnation and backlash. People saw what the inherent end goal of anti-Semitic rhetoric was, and they were averse to it. It thus became difficult for anti-Semites to blatantly unexplain the world because it became seen as an early symptom for genocidal action and authoritarian tyranny. So, for claims of cultural Marxism, a term with undeniable anti-Semitic semiotics, to be taken seriously, they had to become seriously distorted. So how did that happen exactly?
You goddamn knows what happened! Go give me a beer, bitch!
Catherine Belew is a historian, and her book, Bring the War Home, is a fantastic account of making unhappened in action. She argues that patriot and neo-Nazi movements got their start in America in direct reaction to the Vietnam War. Unlike, say, World War II, there was no grand narrative with the Vietnam War, no we are good and they are bad dichotomy for soldiers to feel uncritical pride over. The war was obviously complex, and strong criticism came across the political spectrum. The left saw the war as an imperialist venture, trying to stop the spread of communism. The center saw the war as unjust. With the advent of television, every night people from across the globe saw brutal war deaths in their living room, and it strengthened an aversion to the glorious war as a concept. And the right wing were desperately trying to disregard the soldiers' feelings about the war being pointless, forcing them to do things they didn't want to do, and fight in a war in which they felt there was no point. Further complicating matters was the recent civil rights movement in America. The hegemony of society was undeniably changing. Laws stating that black and Asian Americans had as many civil rights as their white counterparts threatened the Patriots' worldview. Even when an honest assessment of these laws and how they were actually enforced is dubious at best and honestly repugnant. The fact that these laws existed in the first place meant that something was wrong. There was not the ability to unexplain them because they were enshrined into the foundation of their society. So, racists were faced with a major cognitive dissonance here. The hysteric believes those of African origin, or whomever they want to oppress, are too stupid to look after themselves. Yet, we all live in a post-civil rights era where skilled orators, reasoners, and activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X existed. So how does one square the three disparate beliefs of black Americans are threatening the state, that they have taken over the state, and that several members of the skilled orators mentioned before were assassinated? With cultural Marxism, of course. Not unlike the protocols, they have the tremendous ability to nullify bigoted nonsense. This is significant for two main reasons. The first how, and the second being why. First of all, you've likely come across the history of patriot movements aligning themselves with neo-Nazis, and you've likely wondered how people in a country that prided itself on beating the Nazis conceptualize themselves as patriots while being best buds with actual Nazis. The history of events like Ruby Ridge and Waco are illustrative, but rather than give you that history, I'll give you the thesis statement. The answer is that, during the Cold War, the American government demonized communism so incredibly that it became seen as the definitive existential threat against America. So, not only does whiteness unite disparate groups like nothing else, but also the spectre of communism invaded the mind of patriots so brilliantly that social progress, e.g. the civil rights movement and feminism, became seen as communism because said social progress was believed to be un-American.
To restrict drinking and driving here is viewed by some as downright undemocratic.
It's kind of getting communist when a fella can't put in a hard day's work, put in 11, 12 hours a day, and then get in your truck and at least drink 1 or 2 beers.
They're making it laws where you can't drink when you want to. You have to wear a seatbelt when you're driving. And pretty soon we're going to be a communist country.
Alarmingly, communism has hit the home front. Thus, we patriots must align ourselves with neo-Nazis to bring the war back home. This was done so they could protect the white supremacists' foundings of their countries. It is not just that they were racist anyway. It is that patriots unexplained the legacy of their country to what they wanted it to be, and then they tried to defend that. We will explore how this victimhood complex works more in Chapter 5. Secondly, cultural Marxism is used to explain the very reason that social progress happens in a white supremacist state. I cannot overstate the importance of this next concept in the anti-Semitic mind enough. Across all of my research, the work of David Nywert, Catherine Belu, James A. Aho, Michael Kimmel, Robert Wistrich, and Elizabeth Young Bruhl are all littered with the stories of anti-Semites claiming that Jews are behind black autonomy. Anyone who explores anti-Semitic literature carefully will find that when anti-Semites say they hate blacks, their racism reveals itself as an ancillary attitude. They will hate blacks for secondary reasons, perhaps because they believe that the people of colour are controlled politically by the Jews, their real enemies. A black man is a Jew turned inside out. He means that the dirty fecal Jew is really behind or inside the black man. The logic being that the black man in America is a product or a child of Jewish world domination. The anti-Semite uses the Jew to explain the fact that he cannot deny certain parts of the world. He does not confront the fact that the civil rights movement happened because of historic institutionalized anti-miscegenation, eugenics, and racism. Instead, Jews did it. The purpose of this is not to foster ignorance. The anti-Semite does not fill gaps of knowledge and history of the satanic Jew. Rather, he views history as useless to the reality he wishes to live in. The obsessional quality of anti-Semitism is so because of the grand scope of it all. Jews are not just evil. They are the purveyors, the curators, the masterminds of white genocide itself. A concept so big and broad that it justifies literally any response as an act of Coventry. At the core of modern anti-Semitism is the Great Replacement and white genocide, which has inspired so many mass shooters and hate crimes that it likely needs no introduction. The scope of the idea is just tremendously broad. Holocaust denial is an aid of it, cultural Marxism is but a mere method, and it's what the protocols themselves set out to do. The Great Replacement is not an academic theory, it is an expressionist gesture. It is the ultimate tool in unexplaining the world. It frames oneself as the ultimate victim, and it justifies inconceivable cruelty to fight against it. It is a defensive method in that way. The bizarre cocktail of psychoanalytic projection, maladaptive schema, and internal propaganda make you believe that the enemy you seek to eradicate wants to destroy all that you love. It is made manifest in the fear of black men, population anxiety, and the attainment of minority status. It is the vile gut feelings that racists feel in their bellies, unable to articulate in a coherent fashion, and which leads them into defensive violence. Because white genocide is so vast in scope, it necessarily needs to be compressed. When we look at the aftermaths for the Syrian wars of the past decade, and we subsequently see the massive amounts of refugees fleeing war and violence, it is far easier to blame the refugees themselves for the war than the neoliberal governments that started the wars for oil contracts. The actions and choices of millions of individuals are difficult to account for, let alone articulate. So something far easier and more convenient for your shaky worldview is to blame Jews for a worldwide, ill-defined and incoherent plot to destroy whiteness itself. They are defensive, as Klemperer advised, because wanting to defend something is easier to sell to yourself morally than being offensive. Further, as Bruhl observes, racism is used by anti-Semites to recruit racists into anti-Semitism. This isn't just to create unity between groups that might otherwise disagree with one another. The verbal gesture of white genocide gives anti-Semites with a purpose. This is a really important point. Anti-Semitism and white genocide are emotionally powerful to white people because it allows them the fantasy of systemic victimization. They hate civil rights, but they crave the aesthetics of struggling against oppression, because struggle means purpose, and purpose means fighting for your life. You rarely get passive-aggressive anti-Semites. The fact that they use it as a piece of self-definition means that their entire personality resides upon it being true. In using Jews to unexplain behaviour, you frame them as the puppet masters, and thus any rejection for your ridiculous worldview are inoculated against, because anyone who disagrees is a rube, or someone who's been tricked by Jews, or is in blatant bad faith. It is foolproof logic, as used by fools, because they don't even understand how it works. It is worth elevating the subtext to proper text here. Liberals tend to engage with this information seriously. They believe that the anti-Semites must have just read a faulty book at some point, and that's why they are saying ridiculous things. This is because liberals intrinsically believe that everyone believes in the values of truth and institutional justice, that they share the same schemas as everyone else. But anti-Semites inherited the ironic quality from the Nazis. They do not literally believe that Jews are trying to take over the world. The smart ones, at least. Instead, they believe that Jews are somehow responsible for the totality of international banking and politics. This should be understood as the anti-Semitic pretense for criticism. If it were true, it would justify everything else they believe. Liberals have the intrinsic assumption of truth and the assumption that the systems of law are inherently fair. They believe that there are two sides to every story, and the form of debate itself will always weed out lies, because the best argument always wins. Fascists know this, and they actively use it to manipulate liberals and centrists. They do not need to bother themselves with the tiresome chore of honesty and justice, because it gets in the way of telling an emotionally satisfying story. And I must stress that these stories are not crafted by stupid people. Some fools repeat these stories verbatim, but the most dangerous type of anti-Semite is not a skinhead or an alt-right troll. Although, note that those people are dangerous to people of colour and Jews. I do not have enough time to explain the history of the Pioneer Fund, nor do I have the ability to explain right now the history of the funding of eugenics legislation and pseudoscientific research here, as this video is already heaps long. So, to be incredibly, perhaps irresponsibly brief, the Pioneer Fund was a eugenicist foundation, funded by textile billionaires, and that was specifically funded racist and anti-Semitic propaganda to counteract the damage the Nazis did. They quite literally make manifest Lipstadt's assertion of faith being in search of reason, and their so-called research is used to keep the in-group convinced of extremism by supplying them with faulty statistics on subjects like intelligence testing, racist crime statistics, and scientific polygenicist nonsense. I recommend Angela Sinai's book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, and The Funding of Scientific Racism, Wycliffe Draper and the Pioneer Fund by William Tucker, as an easy introduction into that history. It is humorous and scary to note that anti-Semites will be tremendously agitated about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, yet they build entire movements upon the Turner Diaries and the economic funding of scientific racism. It always comes back to projection. Explanations of anti-Semitism usually stop here, but I want to take it one step further, as I'm usually inclined to do. Anti-Semites want to unmake the world, and to do that, they must construct themselves as obsessional Christ figures at the end of history. So how do they do that exactly? Part 3. Philosophy. I could just do something crazy right now. I don't even know if it will sound any good. I haven't done this before, this could be fun. We keep repeating that idea, anti-Semitism as self-definition, and we have discussed that it is an obsessional and narcissistic process. But we are yet to really interrogate how the obsessive character justifies in their own mind their bullshit. We have already discussed anti-Semitic psychoanalysis, but one small problem when actually trying to assess anti-Semites in that manner is that they hate psychoanalysis. Thus, all analysis can't be peer-reviewed by anti-Semites, because they are disagreeable and they wouldn't even give you a good faith assessment of their own mind. I still find it useful, but I want to go further into how victim complexes work within the mind. As I understand it, anti-Semitic self-definition functions as a metaphysical engagement with a delusional person and what he asserts. Real Jews don't exist in the interaction itself, but the verbal gesture nonetheless harms real Jews. So, the remainder of this part will function as an interrogation into this interaction. The first half will navigate the insidious subject, and the second half will discuss the object of their scorn. Because we have focused so much on what makes anti-Semites work, but we have said very little on what we as non-Jews can do as Antifa super soldier allies. Chapter 5, Eternity and Degeneracy. I'm gonna get rid of this desk. The mic stand is still right there, and I feel like I should use it, but I'm a bad boy. I'm changing things up a little bit around here. I've gotten too comfortable. Anti-Semitism is a peculiar type of victim complex. Complexes such as this need an aggressor of some kind, but anti-Semitism is as bizarre as it is because the aggressor is entirely projected. The victim at once believes that they are virginal and innocent, yet the victim necessarily has to be an active participant in the construction of the enemy. They are the persecuted and the persecuted. We discussed the L.T.I. like a million years ago, and how it assists in this process, but I want to head back to the beginning of this episode to thoroughly demonstrate how anti-Semitism actually works at the end of history. Let's talk about historian Timothy Snyder. That worked, it's hilarious. You will recall that Snyder described the end of history as a politics of inevitability. The idea is that when history collapses in on itself, truth will become immaterial.
In 1989, it seemed like there were no alternatives. Communism was over. Capitalism seemed triumphant. People talked about, every time I say this phrase, 10 days go off my life, but I'm going to say it anyway. People talked about the end of history, right? The notion was that now that the Berlin Wall has fallen, now that the Soviet Union is weak, it's soon going to fall apart. The way that we do things is the only way to do things. This is what I call the politics of inevitability. A short word for it is progress. The idea that the future is going to be just like the present, but more and better of the present. The idea that we know the rules of how the present becomes the future.
Snyder bases this concept off of the history of modern Russia, under the most dutiful watch of Vladimir Putin. I'm not terribly interested in the actual history, like the context of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or Boris Yeltsin taking power from Mikhail Gorbachev, nor am I interested right now in Russia's use of cyber warfare, though if you are interested, please check out this book, the work of Peter Pomerantsev. It's like, I don't know, it's Eastern European, I don't know how to pronounce it. And also check out Adam Curtis's new series, Russia 1985 to 1999, Trauma Zone. What I want to do is investigate how the politics of inevitability relate back to making unhappened, ironic expressionism, and how it ties back to anti-Semitism. Easy as, let's go. There are two base assumptions that Snyder makes for us to understand his arguments. The first being that history has progressed as Hegel and Fukuyama described, and secondly, that we exist within the end of history, which is something that I assume as well. You know, just because something is right doesn't mean that it's good. With that as the foundation, Snyder does not mean to say that there are no alternatives to capitalist realism, but rather that the systems at large resist accepting that, because things are as good as they will ever be. You will recall that a politics of inevitability represents our current state of affairs. We no longer need to consider other alternatives because the Cold War is over, hard times are over, and we no longer are burdened with having to come up with new ideas about how we ought to organize ourselves. The lady on the money might change, your car might become more fuel efficient, but the future will more or less look the same as the present. In the 60s, they imagined the future looking like the Jetsons or Star Trek, and now we imagine the future being a new iOS update. Fresh coat of paint. And this is supposedly a good thing, because it means that the territorial wars and violent conflict are but a thing of the past. And because hard times are over, there is no point complaining about the inequalities of modernity for two main reasons. Firstly, because these complaints are nothing compared to how things used to be in ye olden times. Like, if you're complaining about how your boss is making you work overtime for no compensation, then that's like a trifle next to the legacy of child labor in coal mines. Secondly, because history has already ended, things are as good as they will ever be, so systemic critique is kind of oxymoronic in composition. You can't critique what's perfect, dum-dum. The foundational dogma of liberal democracy is that our institutions are fair, and first and foremost they serve the people, which is a fiction that works pretty well. I do not mean to imply that justice or equality are bad ideals to strive towards, but as Snyder points out early in his book, the 2008 financial crash shattered the illusion of the current state of things being inherently just or fair, because it revealed the truth of neoliberalism serving the ultra-wealthy first and foremost, and not unlike serfdom, the power structure of society is about harvesting as much money from the bottom as possible. Further consider climate change, where the future is not very likely to look like today because, as we all know, the ice we skate is getting pretty thin and the water's getting warmer, so you might as well swim. All-Star is about the eternal horrors of neoliberalism and climate change at the end of history. In this 5-hour-long essay, I will... It's a terrible joke, I should have cut that, but I won't. It turns out that a politics of inevitability is just like objectively flawed, and it becomes easier to observe that by the year.
When people become disillusioned with liberalism, or centrist politics more generally, history has shown that they will generally shift towards political extremes. A politics of eternity, then, is a right-wing fantasy. It rises like a ghost from inevitability's rotting corpse. Eternity advocates say that the system is fair, but something has transcended the bounds of reason to corrupt it, and thus we are victims. The logic is that the system failed because someone tried to change a divine system. Divine here meaning infallible, something that transcends the ability to be wrong. Like all immorality, eternity politics begins by making an exception for itself. All else in creation might be evil, but I and my group are good, because I am myself and my group is mine. Others might be confused and bewitched by the facts and passions of history, but my nation and myself have maintained a prehistoric innocence. The entire philosophy that underlies modern Russia can be attributed to Ivan Ilyin, an Eastern Orthodox monarchist and proto-fascist, who would certainly pay for the blue tick on Twitter. I'm sure that'll be a topical thing. Ivan thought that facts were as sinful as passions because neither could be understood in the light of God, which is pretty odd, especially in the context of the Parson naturalist movement that we discussed in episode 2. Scientists were, at one time, considered to seek a mechanistic understanding of nature, as to greater appreciate God's ingenuity. But Snyder explains that Ilyin did not think that people were not holy enough for God. Instead, he kind of played the alternate Uno card, and he said that God was not holy enough for Ilyin. Ha! So, God created the world of sin, and for that reason, God's word on reality is inherently untrustworthy because he allowed sin.
It's not that the facts of the everyday experience are not what matters. What matters is what makes us feel like we're together, right? Truth is not the same thing as factuality. Factuality is irrelevant. The whole world, says Ilyin, is corrupt and spoiled. It doesn't matter what I'm feeling or what you're thinking. All that matters, the only truth is some kind of totality. That's truth.
I am reminded of American patriots, so terror-stricken by the prospect of communism on American soil, that they aligned themselves with neo-Nazis, as if they were the only ones who truly loved their country. Now, it turns out that at this point in history, this was actually this was like a tremendously Russian mindset. I learned this because pretty late into production of this video, I read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. The book features several scenes in which the characters denounce God because of the world that he created. And I think it's interesting to compare the two because to properly understand what Ilyin is trying to say in this instance, because it's pretty complicated. It's worth noting that Ilyin was only born after Dostoevsky's death in 1881, so they weren't colleagues or anything. And another connecting factor is that the characters in Dostoevsky's book are quite anti-Semitic. They use Jewish stereotypes to express their angst about morality in a casual manner. Dostoevsky is the master of expressing vindictive ruminations, so his anti-Semitic tendencies, although horrible and damaging to his credibility, are kind of thematically appropriate in my opinion. It enhances the misery of these characters. Comparing to Ilyin is interesting in that way. The characters in the book deal with a cognitive dissonance, where they're like, the world is meant to be beautiful and perfect, yet child murder and abuse exists, and if God thinks that this is the perfect world, then I don't want to be a part of this world that God likes. Right? They deny God's righteousness because they disagree with the nature of reality. He can't exist because if he did, he would fix everything. It's very much like baby's first atheist type moment. Ilyin was less concerned with the nature of reality, as he was kind of more interested in the opposite. He was upset that the church didn't lean further into fantasy. The church, through scientific endeavors and the practice of helping the poor through social work, was too socially liberal. They wanted to help sinners, so all else in creation might be evil according to Ilyin, but I am good because my group is good. Ilyin placed himself as the good Russian and Christ figure. They are innocent because they recognize the sin of the world, and then they rebel against it. Thus, the in-group is divinely chosen to be uniquely pure and special, but at the same time they are persecuted by everyone else, like Jesus on the cross. So on top of all of that nonsense, Ilyin was a strong opponent to the Bolshevik Revolution. Said revolution, as Snyder describes, was principally associated with youth, and after years had passed and the Soviet system became mundane, it became associated with the old guard, your boring dya-dya. The genius of applying the work of Ilyin here is that you can use nostalgia for the past alongside the fascist contempt for communism, and you can reclaim the youth of the revolution for yourself. So of course, Vladimir Putin cites Ilyin as a major personal inspiration. Russia is uniquely innocent, specifically persecuted by the amorphous West, and because of that, they can do whatever the hell they want to fight against perceived injustices. Coventry. In a system such as this, the state has to maintain the illusion that it is fair and just, and it does this by suppressing facts, oppressing speech, and repeating values they like until it becomes true. This is the politics of eternity, and while it's scary, it is not unprecedented. I cannot find the book to save my life. It's in one of these free books over here. But there's a big difference between Soviet and Nazi authoritarianism, and that difference was that Russia innovated on explaining people by cutting them out of photographs and removing their names from old newspapers. The state aimed to make the populace feel skeptical about what they did know, so that they would foster trust in the state instead. The politics of eternity, as they appear in Russia, aims to make the populace averse to truth in the first place. The state might be corrupt, but so is every other state. No one tells the truth, so we may as well repeat the things that we like to hear. Trust in the government, then, is a kind of protection racket. The state will protect people from outsiders who want to harm them, and following Eileen's lead, because God is not pious enough for them, trust in the state is keeping life good. We are good because we are us. Out-group scapegoating, then, is a powerful mode of social control, and one of the main groups aiming to destroy Russia are the gays. Apparently. I'm gonna do it! To explain this topic, consider this speech by Vladimir Putin. I want you to pay close attention to the subtext he slips in right at the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am gay, I like long, big cocks. I am a super gay, I like long, big cocks.
This is a classic video from around 2014, and it was originally supposed to be Putin trying to get the World Cup to come to Russia, and yeah, hardy-ha, it's very funny to hear a dictator say that they like big roosters. Let's generously set aside the framing of your political opposition as being gay to discredit them, even if they themselves are homophobic, a la the drawing of Donald Trump and Putin in loving embraces. And let's take a look and see how this silly video can actually tell us something interesting about the politics of eternity. I am not kidding. This video, as delightful and childish as it is, was banned in Russia. Precisely because it mocked Putin as the masculine savior of the innocent Russian people. So, I think that we should follow Elizabeth Young Bruhl's lead, and we should explore what Russia's homophobia can tell us about being an innocent Christ figure, and how it relates back to antisemitism. Because, whether they are obsessive or narcissistic, they both maintain magnificent victim complexes. Homophobes don't have rational reasons to dislike the gays, and as we explored when discussing two-sex narcissism, the homophobe rationalizes their contempt for how awesome gay sex is, and concludes that it is immoral for society. Like, the fact that it happens, like Eileen's contempt for God, is proof of the world being evil. They feel a general disgust in their bellies, and they have rationalized it into a generalized contempt. This contempt is used to prove that they are divinely good. One of the most genius moves of the Putin regime was to associate this contempt with democracy. Human sexuality is an inexhaustible raw material for the manufacture of anxiety. The attempt to place heterosexuality within Russia and homosexuality beyond was factually ludicrous, but the facts were beside the point. The purpose of the anti-gay campaign was to transform demands for democracy into a nebulous threat to Russian innocence. Voting equates West equates sodomy. Russia had to be innocent, and all problems had to be the responsibility of others. The purpose of homophobic propaganda is to associate those belly pains with democracy, because a state where everyone is free, and in which everyone has an equal say, will eventually and apparently lead to lustful degeneracy. It combines the individual homophobic prejudice, and it strengthens it with the belief of the wise nation, in which a state's historic homophobia and antisemitism is proof of ancient tradition. Wisdom is wise if we still agree with it. When in reality, it's just scapegoating, a convenient misdirection of the serfs. According to Snyder, it was precisely because Putin's dictatorship had destabilized Russia, and under his watch a neoliberal oligarchy took control, that he had to blame the ills of the country on someone. Thus, to be against Russia was to be in favor of sodomy. An illustrative example for us is the infamous and disgraced Italian politician Silvio Berlusconi.
They point to basically call girls being hired to perform at these after-dinner parties in the so-called Bunga Bunga room, where some of them, for instance, dressed up as Obama and engaged in sort of semi-erotic fondling of one another.
This video took like so long to make that he literally died months after I wrote that line. Rest in piss, shithead. This man has done so many things that it would take an entire series to explore every single stupid anti-Semitic, misogynistic thing he's ever done. But for our purposes, he was kicked out of the Italian presidency in 2011, and in 2013 he was convicted of tax fraud. Putin said of this conviction that if Berlusconi was gay, no one would ever lay a finger on him. So, let's think about that. Berlusconi was an infamous misogynist who was brazenly corrupt, but Putin's defense here has two interesting implications. The first and most obvious being that there is some kind of global conspiracy, read the subtext, to degenerate the in-group, which is so brazenly anti-Semitic that I don't even think I have to explain it. You know, cabal equals degeneracy equals Jews. Secondly, you've probably heard the conservative gesture of special privileges, in which bigots assign the existence of minorities to some kind of nebulous luxury that only the minority has. I don't do that, they sook. Thus, no one should. Furthering the narrative that being gay is a choice and that people are purposefully choosing to destroy Russian society. It is an envious notion, and not only does it fuel this victim complex, but it goes back to the mechanics of the narcissist backlash. The world is anatomically correct. Everything is in its rightful place, and thus the existence of gay people infers that these people believe that they are so special that they supersede and pervert their rightful place. This blatant resentment is not valid because the purpose of using homophobia is not to enact reform. It is to distract people from the prospect of reform. To sexualize the enemy was to make politics into a biological conflict, and to trade the hard work of reform and freedom for endless anxious preening. Anxious preening is the lifeblood of the politics of eternity. You feel a nostalgia for a time before all of this gay rights nonsense. You have likely heard an older relative or a family friend observe that when they were young, there weren't any gay people around, which, no, they were in the closet, afraid of ostracism and of violence. Eternity advocates likewise feel nostalgic for a time when their political enemies were too afraid to seek civil rights, so they suggest that modern calls for equality cannot be organic. They must be manufactured calls for degeneracy made by some kind of nebulous or ill-defined group. Are we even surprised that people use antisemitism to fill in these cognitive gaps? In the spoof video, Putin's words are being distorted, and part of the comedy is that it comes from the fact that he's being so profane and crass. It is as if the editor of the video is themselves benefiting from gay privilege. To dare distort the leader, the protector of Russian innocence, is obscene. The logic goes, my Jaja was persecuted by the KGB over nothing, and these homosexuals can do something equally terrible without recourse? That right there is privilege. Thus, it had to be taken down to restore dignity to said leader. It is unfair that gay extremists can get away with this. You've likely observed the shifting of rhetorical strategy. The enemy are degenerate, but they are powerful enough to threaten the very innocence of Russia. And because Putin implies the powerful cabal of degenerates, that's an oxymoron for you, are ruining the sacredness of the state, all of this is in aid of keeping one party in power. Remember that these are not authentic beliefs in homophobia. Not that that would be better. But Putin is using the disgust of homophobia to consolidate political power. When gay people stop being useful, they will move to another scapegoat. I'm not going to entertain any kind of notion of Ukraine being socially or politically fascist in any way, shape, or form. That is Russian state propaganda, and you are required as a critical thinker and as a human being to disregard those claims as bullshit. The war is an ongoing story, and I'm not going to give a definitive history of said war, but these beliefs are actually epistemically useful to understand how defensive victim complexes work. So according to Snyder, the Russian war propaganda in World War II associated Nazism with being anti-Russian, and logically that was like a fair assessment, as the Nazis wanted to kill all Slavic peoples and they hated Soviet communism. When an enemy wants to holistically slaughter you and your country, they become outsiders, and whatever they want to do becomes anti-Russian. A side effect of this means the lines between fascists and any other kind of enemy becomes blurred. The collective states of the Soviet Union become Russia alone. Even though Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, when Russians call Ukraine a fascist state, they do not literally mean that the state is politically fascist. Rather, Ukraine's refusal to surrender to annexation is fascist because it's anti-Russian. Then they employ the cry of fascist as an irony on the global stage. Those not in the know and sympathetic to Russia as the last bastion of white innocence are ignorant of this context, which itself is under so many layers of irony, because Russia, a state based on white supremacy, authoritarianism, and oligarchy, is socially fascist. Ilyin was a fascist, and Putin loves Ilyin. So we are presented with a curious paradox where anyone who is against Russia are fascists, except for Russia who actually are fascists.
not dissimilar to patriots who hate their own country. You gesture towards your enemy being the real fascists, and you posture that you are the poor victims. Snyder refers to this mindset as being schizofascism. He is careful to state that, as I have mentioned before, the labeling of fascist is verbal gesture. He means that Russia is forever innocent and incapable of the evils of fascism. That is not a logical flaw, but the very point of it all. It isn't fascism or genocide when Russia does it. The entire purpose of the politics of eternity is to maintain that as the baseline understanding for global politics. Nothing can ever be fixed or changed because change is fascist and Russia is innocent. To further illustrate this, let's interrogate the concept of corruptness, because it would be like one thing if Putin, Berlusconi, Donald Trump, or even people like Jean-Marie Le Pen of France's National Front were actually Christ figures, so perfect in every way that their followers were right in disparaging everyone else. But these figures are blatantly corrupt, obviously so. Liberals like to sit back and smugly laugh at this, as if they are just smarter than the conservative populists. I noticed this, I am smarter than them, but this misses the point. It is not that you have elucidated a piece of evidence that they were unaware of, nor is it that you have pointed out a dialogical inconsistency. The point is that they don't care if their worldview makes sense. Pointing out that drag shows hurt kids but school shootings do isn't education, it is smug dunking that only benefits the liberal. It doesn't fight for a solution, it merely designates blame onto someone who is not them.
That is hypocrisy at its highest order.
Frustratingly, it fails to interrogate why populists believe what they do. The most critical piece of the puzzle is this, and I need you to pay attention, okay? Get up from your phone, look at me. Conservative populists know that the people they follow are corrupt. They believe that all politicians are corrupt, so they may as well use corruption in ways that benefits them. At the same time, they will weaponize the image of the corrupt politician to shame their political enemies. This is their kind of praxis. You can't shame the shameless, thus you should attack your enemies who can be shamed so they will go away. You might believe that this is in such contradiction to so many of their other beliefs, the wise nation, the innocent in-group, and I have to state plainly, they do not care, because to them, politics is the distribution of corruption. The problem is that corruption isn't always useful to the in-group. Thus, you can get rid of politicians who break the rules and affirm yourself as an establishment that disregards the rules, because the rules, the very notion of fairness itself, is degenerate if it doesn't push your agenda forward. Schizofascism, then, is a maneuver in a game of chess. You care very little for the nature of reality because it isn't conducive to the gains of the in-group. The politics of the in-group can best be described as a kind of sadomasochistic populism, in which the world is not hopeful, but it entails immense suffering. And the goal of politics, aside from the distribution of corruption, is to make your enemies suffer more than yourself. Those who accept eternity politics do not expect to live longer, happier, or more fruitful lives. They accept suffering as a mark of righteousness, if they think that guilty others are suffering more. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. The pleasure of life is that it can be nastier, more brutish, and shorter for others. Russia under Putin has a long history of anti-Semitism. It is just that the gays and Ukrainians are a more effective scapegoat in recent years. But all of these techniques, the philology of strategies and the semiotics of scapegoats, are all based on anti-Semitic stereotypes. The notion of the global cabal of gay people plotting to destroy Russia is blatantly anti-Semitic. And as we have discussed at the end of chapter 4, it is great replacement logic. Whenever you hear about the Rainbow Mafia or the globalists, it is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. They have not been duped because this is the world as they wish it were. A world in which all of their personal ills are diagnosed as coming from one small ill-defined contradictory cabal. And then they promise that once they destroy that cabal, that life will be perfect. But that isn't true, because the anti-Semitic schemas they have developed require them to be perpetually victimized and in need of an omnipresent villain of dialectic liquidity. History has shown that anti-Semitism proliferates in spaces where there are very few Jews. Look at anti-Semitism in post-war Poland or in Japan, for instance. The politics of eternity are what happens when neoliberalism collapses and cultural Marxism becomes a legitimate concern of the state. With all of this in consideration, I urge you to view the malignant moans of antisemites trapped in their own misery and incapable of happiness as useless. Useless in regard to the practice of history, philosophy, morality, and metaphysics. There is no simple cure to fix existential schema poisoning, and unfortunately, the anti-Semite is entirely responsible for getting out and becoming healthy. Anti-Semites use Jews to define what they are against.
Anti-Semites project their own self-hatred onto Jews. Anti-Semites delude themselves under an avalanche of hatred and irony, and they lose contact with their own humanity. Anti-Semites attempt to unexplain the world by holding on to said hatred, and anti-Semites do all of this while framing themselves as innocent virginal martyrs. The scope of all of it is such that it has led to the deaths of millions of Jews throughout history. Yet, Judeophobes are the victims, the poor virginal victims, the ones who are right because they were just made that way, and all critique is merely a call for their destruction. Victims so profoundly wounded and damaged that kids on the internet making Putin say he likes penises is proof of global Jewish conspiracy. I have a hardline position that we should not waste our time in trying to convince anti-Semites not to be anti-Semitic. We have to move past them, and this does not mean that de-radicalization is not a goal to aspire towards. Because it is. Like, if you know someone in your life who is not too far gone, it can be worth trying to talk to them out of anti-Semitism and explaining how anti-Judaism shaped history. I believe in humanity, and I believe in reason, but convincing anti-Semites to stop being hateful cannot be the only goal that we strive towards. So, I want to shift, after 7 hours of discussion, to discuss what we can do as allies to help Jews. Chapter 6, The Kosher Triangle. I think that an epistemic critique in part is based upon the alignment of schema. It's a difficult concept to describe because it isn't a strict ideology, but rather a cluster of ethical and political heuristics. We've explored how this manifests in the form of conspiracism in my video on the subject, and throughout this video we have critiqued and prodded the nature of anti-Semitic epistemics. But in this chapter, I am interested in seeing how this coagulates in the form of liberalism and socialism, because we on the left, although we tend to be less vitriolic and violent, can still use anti-Semitic tropes, if unintentionally. There is not an equivalence to be made between the extreme right and the extreme left on this topic, but we are not immune to the semiotics of the greedy banker and the protocols, because they have informed conspiracism itself. So I think it wise to return once again to the beginning of this video and discuss scrawny little guy Jean-Paul Sartre. Before we get started, if I had a solution to anti-Semitism, I would not be doing this, because I would be living in luxury, lying recumbent in the brilliance that would entail, and lounging about with my Nobel Peace Prizes. I do not have solid answers, and I am not Jewish, but I want to present what I have learned, so that we can start a conversation in a practical and intelligent manner. Because, as we will learn, speaking about anti-fascist interest and not including Jews in the conversation will only lead to disaster. Sartre had a fascinating relationship to Judaism. He was an atheist and an anti-fascist Marxist, imprisoned by the Nazis, and when he got free, he joined the French resistance. His paper, Anti-Semite and Jew, is lauded as one of the most incisive interrogations into the internal ruminations of the anti-Semite. Further, at the end of his life, he converted to Messianic Judaism. His conversion sent massive shockwaves across the continental school of philosophy. His lifelong non-monogamous partner, Simone de Beauvoir, believed that Sartre had been brainwashed after he denounced socialism and existentialism in favor of Messianic Judaism. And look, I hold no judgment for anyone at death's door discovering religion. But this is tremendously surprising. I would like to explain briefly that Messianic Judaism has an almost universal hatred in the Jewish community. Jews don't agree on very many things, but we vade so those messianic schmucks get on their nerves. As we've discussed throughout this series, Judaism doesn't really have a strong emphasis on conversion, and Jews of the messianic variety go overboard on trying to convert other Jews and Gentiles alike. It's closer to evangelical Christianity than actual Jewish faith. I find this to be essential context to give before exploring anti-Semite and Jew further, because the biggest critique scholars have for the work is that Sartre seemingly is a bit ambivalent about Judaism. And I don't wish to psychoanalyze him, but I read Sartre's book as impassioned about the rights of Jews. The ambivalence might have come from the distance one puts between themselves and their subject to critically analyze them academic-wise. I honestly can't help but feel as if the faith he picked in the last years of his life are in some small way part of that passion. At least that's how I feel when reading it. So I want to discuss some of the strengths before we get into its flaws. Core to Sartre's argument is his famous notion of bad faith, which isn't how I defined it in my conspiracism series. Bad faith is an existential notion. Sartre was a big advocate for living authentically, doing what you want and being open about it. Existentialism is, according to Beauvoir, about dealing with ambiguity. Without God, you don't have a place in the universe. You just exist. Sartre said that your essence precedes your existence. You have been made without a purpose, aside from the fact that your mom wanted to quell her own existential anxiety. So bad faith is ignoring your meaninglessness and acting as if you do matter. Bad faith looks like slaving away in a system that you detest because liberal establishments are wholly just. This is not an advocation for, murder
in most circumstances, Sartre was kind of wild sometimes. But rather, at the core of existentialism is the need to find meaning, and bad faith means finding poor meanings in your works. Antisemitism is blatant bad faith in the rhetorical and existential sense. Recall Sartre's anti-Semitic classmate who, in his nugatory vanity, believed his academic shortcomings were proof of virtue. It is not that he genuinely believed this, but rather this was the kind of story he wished to be true. We have here a basic fear of oneself and of truth. What frightens them is not the content of truth, of which they have no conception, but the form of truth itself, that thing of indefinite approximation. It is as if their own existence were in continual suspension, but they wish to exist all at once and right away. They do not want acquired opinions, they want them to be innate. There is a tremendous cognitive dissonance here. Innate opinions stand here for divinity. The subjective or even relative nature of reality is threatening because it means the world cannot be easily divvied between good and evil. Yet, at the same time, anti-Semites have an expressionist view on reality. Once again, recall Deborah Lipstadt and her belief that anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial are faith in search of reason. The anti-Semite has chosen hate because hate is a faith. At the outset, he has accepted to devaluate words and reasons. How entirely at ease he feels as a result. How futile and frivolous discussions about the rights of the Jew appear to him. He has placed himself on the other ground from the beginning. If out of courtesy he consents for a moment to defend his point of view, he lends himself, but he does not give himself. We can see from Sartre's writings many of the ideas that germinated into fuller beliefs from the work of Elizabeth Young-Bruhl and Tim Snyder. I don't wish to give a play-by-play of this book, but I laid this groundwork to discuss its ending. Sartre writes in chapter 2 about the concept of Jewish avarice, which he believes is a manufactured quality not dissimilar from the fetishization of the hysteric. Like with the supposed black lust for white women, anti-Semites craft belief of Jews being spiteful towards Gentiles, a plainly projected quality that the anti-Semite needs to be true for their worldview to work. And Sartre speaks of this concept in the context of liberalism, or as he describes it as democratic liberalism. Jewish avarice is an obviously manufactured claim, and the Democrat notices this as well. Thus, liberals and Jews are aligned with each other. This might seem like a bit of a tenuous connection at first, but Sartre explains that liberals are connected to reality, whereas anti-Semites are disconnected, so they are unlikely to agree on very many things. Their conversations tend to speak past one another, because their base schemas are incompatible. The Democrat is then seen as a valued ally, because he sees Jews as being made of flesh and blood rather than avarice and imagination. But as Sartre describes, the Democrat is at best a feeble protector. Like a liberal is not described solely as left of center, as described today, but rather a believer in democracy generally. Thus, the Democrat can be left and right of center. Democrats are not immune to anti-Semitic rhetoric if it aligns with the values of racism and sexism. Recall in chapter 4 when we discussed anti-Semites claiming that black men were controlled by Jews. If you can sugarcoat anti-Semitism in language that you feel is sympathetic to your own hysterical and narcissistic anxieties, then these aversions can be superseded. So liberal anti-Semitism tends to come in the form of respectability politics. Thus, there may be detected in the most liberal Democrat a tinge of anti-Semitism. He is hostile to the Jew to the extent that the latter thinks of himself as a Jew. He expresses this hostility by a sort of indulgent and amused irony, as when he says of a Jewish friend of whose Semitic origin it's easily recognizable, "Just the same, he is too Jewish." Or when he declares, "The only thing I have against Jews is their clannishness. If you let one in, he will bring 10 more with him." During the occupation, the Democrat was profoundly and sincerely indignant at the anti-Semitic persecutions, but he sighed from time to time. "The Jews will come back from exile with such insolence and hunger for vengeance that I am afraid of a new outburst of anti-Semitism." What he really feared was that the persecutions might have helped give the Jew a more definitive consciousness of himself. Democrats will protect Jews so long as they are the good ones, upstanding citizens, as long as they tone down the Jewishness. As Sartre says, the anti-Semite reproaches the Jew for being Jewish, whereas the Democrat condemns the Jew for willfully considering himself a Jew, which is seen as having little qualitative value in its secular world. Sartre then dedicates much of the remainder of his book to the taxonomy of Jewish stereotypes, and concludes that they are nonsensical holdovers from Christianity. They are a desperate need to distance themselves from the aesthetics of piety. Much of the anti-Semitic disgust with Jews, so similar in function to Putin's homophobia, is to convince a person that biological disgust reaction is as relevant and useful as an actual logical thought. The fixation of Jewish hair being curly and of big noses is pure scientific polytheism, eugenical nonsense, and the emotions that underlie it attempts to convince you that the correlation is causation. Jews with beards, according to Sartre, causes anti-Semitism because curly beards are framed as a relative qualitative factor in politics.
How am I to disentangle the physical from the moral? His beard is black and curly. That is a somatic characteristic. What strikes me above all is that he lets it grow. By that he expresses his attachment to the traditions of the Jewish community. He indicates that he has come from Poland, that he belongs to immigrants of the first generation. Is his son any less of a Jew for being clean-shaven? Thus, it is no exaggeration to say that it is the Christians who have created the Jew in putting an abrupt stop to his assimilation and in providing him, in spite of himself, with a function in which he has since prospered. Correlation does not equal causation. It just doesn't. Jews having beards doesn't make them more Jewish. Like, okay, weird example coming up. My parents got divorced after seeing Spider-Man 3. It's the last memory I have of my family being all together in the same room. Imagine how absurd it would be if I blamed all Jews categorically for my parents' divorce just because Sam Raimi was born into a Jewish family. My parents hated each other before they went into the cinema, and it was not Raimi who tipped their marriage over the edge. This argument is exactly as logically consistent as the majority of anti-Semitic belief. When you stop to think about any of this, it isn't the logic that sells the idea, it's the emotion, the hazy anger and wonder an 8-year-old Angus felt in 2007 in a musty Hobart theatre, just old enough to remember the violence of the breakup, and a bit too young to understand the implications of all of it, and then in a desperate need to redirect and sublimate my fear of my parents just hating each other, and you keep checking early YouTube for the release date of Spider-Man 4, as if that will be the thing to bring them back together. When in reality, none of this is relevant, and Raimi just made a banging picture. Spider-Man 3 goes hard, actually. 20 hours. The anti-Semitic belief that Jewish beards are part of the problem is but a ridiculous cry from an angry person, afraid of personal development and of change. Anti-Semites need to feel as if they have been traumatized by Jews, because if they had been, it would be proof of how terrible Jews actually are. In my opinion, Sartre has a pretty good handle on anti-Semitism, and as we have discussed, it is useful for understanding individual anti-Semites. So what does he say we ought to do then with all of this knowledge? What is Sartre's prescription? And he has two ideas that are worth discussing. Firstly, Sartre is in favour of broad education. Antisemitism proliferates with the ignorance of history. The highest level anti-Semites actively distort history to rewrite reality as they see fit. Thus, as an act of inoculation, we ought to fund history classes for young people, which is a sentiment that I will return to in my conclusion. Secondly, Sartre is sometimes critiqued as calling anti-Semitism a poor man's snobbery. It's an idea that you've probably come across in anti-fascist conversation, in which the proles only attack Jews because they aren't smart enough to comprehend the world in more complex ways, global finance and whatnot. Recall the legacy of Survey to further illustrate this. I think that this is wrong, but Sartre argues that anti-Semitism at its very core is a class issue. Antisemitism is a mythical bourgeois representation of the class struggle, and they could not exist in a classless society. Antisemitism manifests the separation of men and their isolation in the midst of the community, the conflict of interest and the cross-currents of passions. It can only exist in a society where a rather loose solidarity unites strongly structured pluralities. It is a phenomenon of social pluralism. In a society whose members feel mutual bonds of solidarity because they are all engaged in the same enterprise, would be no place for it. Thus, the way to protect Jews, according to Sartre, is with socialism. In a classless society, there will be no persecution of Jews because we will all be equal. Sartre wrote that in 1948, and I think for the year that it came out that it's an honest conclusion. I read this essay and I agreed with the conclusion vigorously. As I'm cursed to make parties miserable, I am an avowed leftist. I find all the literature to be quite compelling, and I thought this genuinely could be the solution. I was even willing to make it the final word of this video. And then I thought about the paper for a month, because it takes me forever to make anything. I must stress here that even though I posture myself as a big-brained smart boy on the internet, I am a moron. If I were clever, it wouldn't have taken me like a year to make this video. And even I can be fooled by passion and prose. It occurred to me that the Soviet Union was viciously anti-Semitic. And sure, Sartre probably didn't know that much about the Union outside of his writings of Lenin, whatever. But I contented with myself of Sovietism not being real communism, and that didn't count. Sometimes you're making something and you happen to read something else, and it completely realigns the priorities you have for the thing that you are making. As I started The Anatomy of Prejudices, I didn't know it mentioned anti-Semitism as much as it did. I just wanted to read it for fun. And as Liz goes on, she keeps mentioning anti-Semite and Jew with this air of contempt, small passages, tiny quotes, innuendo. I guess that she was going somewhere with it, but it seemed unwarranted to me, especially since I thought so many of Sartre's observations were poignant. I maintain at this moment that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him remains an excellent rule of thumb. But the final chapter of Rawls' book is a scathing critique of Sartre's paper, and it blew my fucking mind out the back of my skull. Not clickbait. I was personally attacked by a dead psychoanalyst at 3 a.m. I was reading it, and I just knew it had to be the end of this series. When I said the invent him idea was comparable to a chicken and egg scenario 100 years ago, that was Brule. This concept works best as a metaphor, a prognosis as I framed it, especially since anti-Semites would invent attributes. But according to young Brule, this chicken or egg model ignores both historical and social context. The attributes anti-Semites craft are not mere imaginations pulled directly out of their asses. Usury had a political context. The death of Christ had a political context. And to pretend that they don't, and simply attribute all the violent rhetoric to the anti-Semites' imagination alone, ignores what made these stereotypes emotionally resonant in the first place. It abstracts anti-Semitic responsibility for historic hate crimes onto Jews themselves. Like, stop acting how they say you act if you don't want to be persecuted, dearest Jews. For as much as anti-Semite and Jew rails against Democrats for falling into anti-Semitism, Sartre kind of does that as a part of his critique. The main problem she has with anti-Semite and Jew is this. The book is confounding. Like of assigning anti-Semitism to a chicken or egg scenario, it robs the anti-Semites of their agency. It tries to be a leftist critique of centrism and liberalism, and yet in its construction and argumentation, it perpetuates anti-Semitism itself. Sartre's book represents the way in which the critiques of anti-Semitism from the left have so often, by misconstruing the problem of anti-Semitism, offered solutions that exacerbated the problem. This is best demonstrated, according to young Brule, in Sartre's final diagnosis, the call for socialism to eradicate anti-Semitism along class lines. To understand that, we need to go on a tangent to comprehend the scope of it. Liz compares anti-Semite and Jew to another book of Sartre's called Black Orpheus, which calls for the eradication of colonialism by having all people of color rise up against their oppressors, which sounds pretty badass. In the 40s, this paper was admittedly pretty radical, but Sartre goes about it, according to young Brule, by appealing to respectability politics. Sartre likewise calls for socialism as a means of eradicating racism through the lines of class equality, linking back to his original idea of anti-Semitism being a poor man's snobbery. Racism is merely the trifles of stupid people, and socialism will definitively fix it. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely black socialists. The two concepts go together very, very well. But the point here is that Sartre assumes that all colonized people essentially live under a state of bad faith, where they see the hierarchy as ordained, and that's why they follow it, which is very wrong. The violence of a white supremacist state is what upholds that white supremacist state. The Haitians didn't uncolonize themselves by calmly talking to their masters and reasoning them into socialism. They killed the oppressive bastards because they were doing the oppressing. Brule argues that Sartre uses a similar line of logic when discussing Jews. Because of Jewish bad faith, Jews allow their own oppression, and they must discard their own Jewishness to escape anti-Semitism. With the prescription of socialism, according to Brule, this will require the annihilation of Judaism itself. Sartre's suggestion about how the Gentiles could solve their problem and save themselves would be costly for the Jews. Socialism would permit the Jews to assimilate, and assimilated, they would no longer exist as the Gentiles' problem. They would no longer exist as a distinct social group. And if you think, well, maybe this is just Sartre's general atheism in which no religion would exist under socialism. Or maybe this is because Brule's a liberal and she might not understand the ins and outs of socialism. But no, Brule retorts, Sartre went quite beyond the general Marxist position of the necessary future withering away of religious groups by arguing that no authentic Jew would find this solution, the dissolution of the Jews as a group, strange, because no authentic Jew is Jewish for any other reason than to protect himself from anti-Semitism that has invented the category of Jews. Sartre not only presumed to speak for the victims, he also told the victims giving up their historical identity would be of no loss to them. Which I think we can all agree is quite alarming. Leftist anti-Semitism is thus the destruction of identity and culture, whereas right-wing anti-Semitism is the holistic destruction of Judaism. Going back to the Spider-Man 3 example, you have no idea how long I've been waiting to drop that bomb. I've been doing this for like 2 years, and this is the first time I brought it up. How funny is that? I have more restraint than a Buddhist monk.
How's the pie?
So good.
Going back to the Spider-Man Free example, it is useful to view how qualitative factors such as curly beard can become valid in the anti-Semitic mind via gut emotions. But Sartre's use of this implies that it is a Jew's own fault for anti-Semitism because he looks Jewish. Once again, he says the critique, and then he does the critique by accident. And before the leftists in my audience get mad, Bruhl is not saying that we want to destroy culture intrinsically. Instead, she pleads for us to consider Jewish interests before we prescribe sweeping reforms. Jews have to be in on the plan, same as all other colonized people. She's also not saying that Jews cannot be socialists. That is plainly false. But there is a reason they say that someone is a Jewish Zionist, or in favor of anarcho-Judaism, because Jews have to consider their own future, whereas Gentiles just don't consider Jews to be part of it in the first place. This is a massive oversight for an ally to make. It is respectability politics, especially since under this model, it is not the anti-Semite who needs the Jew, it is the Jew who needs the anti-Semite. Sartre's model of bad faith in this context infers that there are two people of binary types. One group are the authentic good socialists, and the other are the anti-Semites and the Jews who both exist as bad faith actors. One is a flower, the other is a rock. It would be one thing if socialism did actually solve anti-Semitism, but as we've already discussed, that did not happen. And the closest things we've actually seen to socialism in the past 100 years have still been vigorously anti-Semitic. Thus, the only way to get rid of anti-Semitism is to annihilate Jewish culture. And when I read that, I yelped, like my mind expanded an extra dimension. Quote, according to Sartre, socialist and Jew share a political solidarity. We are all bound to the Jew because anti-Semitism leads directly to National Socialism. But in Sartre's vision of the future, the solidarity of non-Jew and Jew is keyed in their alterity. It cannot be associated with a Jew defining himself as a Jew, much less fighting his own battle as a Zionist. In the socialist future, no one will need the Jew, or presumably the man of color or the woman. The Jew will be glad to give up their Jewishness, so there will be no Jews. The socialism that Sartre advocates for here is an accidental leftist white supremacy. The fact of the matter is that identity politics are as important as class warfare, because transphobes don't go after trans people on the basis of class. It is entirely about identity. It is white savior nonsense. And if I may quote one of the best to ever do it, FD Signifier.
Essentially, if you read Marx and Trotsky and Gramsci and What You Want to Do Ski and whomever else, but not Du Bois, Fanon, Hooks, Crenshaw, etc., you might be a leftist white supremacist.
White people are not going to make a non-racist system because they are ignorant of how racism affects people within that system. I would not go as far as to call Sartre, like, a fascist, or say that he was performing leftist solidarity, even if he did renounce socialism at the end of his life. But he utterly fails to consider what socialism could mean to other socialists. White socialism cannot be intersectional because only a bunch of brocialists were at the table. You cannot behind John Rawls' veil of ignorance because you don't have anything to guide you through your own ignorance. All of this is not to tear down Sartre's wish, in his own mind, to help Jews escape persecution. He is on a basis of good faith. He's just wrong. But what it does mean is that we need to allow Jews to do it in their own way. That's what I meant when I said that this is the foundation that we have built our house upon. The West at large was built on anti-Semitism, so the semiotics and the stereotypes are so omnipresent that we sometimes don't recognize them. These conversations must be collaborative and intersectional. Another person who was famously critical of Sartre's Black Orpheus was West Indian psychologist and black radical Frantz Fanon. Fanon trained as a psychoanalyst, and in the last few years of his practice, he noticed that all of his patients couldn't be cured by psychoanalysis alone because all of their ills were due to being subject in a colonized state. He was present for the Algerian Revolution, and he decided to stop being a tool of the state and fight for Algerian autonomy from French colonialism. Now, Bruhl uses Fanon's classic book Black Skin, White Masks to refute anti-Semite and Jew, so I went ahead and I read it, and somewhat surprisingly, Fanon also used anti-Semitism to demonstrate different types of prejudices with tact and passion. It's worth noting, as Bruhl does, that Fanon viewed black equality as being gender neutral, which is great, and his book does say some very incisive things about the nature of racist sexism, but it doesn't linger on women's issues as much. It's also worth noting that the two men were actually acquainted with one another, and Sartre even wrote the preface for Fanon's second book. I wouldn't go as far to claim that Bruhl's assessment is vitriolic, but it is angry, and that is warranted in my opinion. It makes for a truly electrifying reading experience, and I don't say that very often about academic books. And all of this is not to say that, like, woman emotional are that bad, because the emotions are precisely what make it powerful. I wish more academic books could be written with such fiery passion and have less of the boring, stone-cold masculine tone these books are plagued by.
But I view the disagreements between Fanon and Sartre as if they were playing tennis with one another. The refutations are in pursuit of greater knowledge. It is a romantic viewing on my part, I cannot deny that. But I don't read much contempt in Fanon's critiques of Black Orpheus or in Antisemite and Jew. Instead, he's like, okay, look at you cross-eyed white boy, here's how it actually is. Their unity can also be explained by an obscure literary movement that both authors immersed themselves in. Negritude was a literary movement in the 1930s. It is primarily seen as an early Black Pride movement, one in which assigned being African origin as a point of pride. It grew out of the Harlem Renaissance movement, and it was helmed by Black French intellectuals. All of this is extremely badass, and for the early 30s and 40s, this was considered pretty radical. Sartre wrote Black Orpheus as a critique of the movement, where he described the movement as being anti-racist racism. He wasn't saying that the movement was racist against white people or any dumb bullshit like that. Instead, he was arguing in favor of a colorblind socialism. Since it was so similar to what he said about Jews, I think it's worth exploring it briefly. Bruhl focuses on Sartre's use of language and how it signaled a condescending solidarity. Sartre moved back and forth between a your and an our when addressing his white audience. But with his other audience, his black audience, he moved on another plane. For interpreting negritude to his black audience, he used the language of universalism. This was the same we marching out into the future who had spoken in anti-Semite and Jew, and anticipated the end of all particularist histories and culture, all Jewishness, all negritude in the socialist revolution. Many black intellectuals heard this universalist we with mixed feelings, but political events ultimately directed the differences of opinion between them. It is not specifically a bad thing that Sartre wanted unity between people of colour and whites, but it came across as condescending respectability politics. By the time that Fanon critiqued Black Orpheus, the negritude movement was over. But with this context, we can explore Fanon's thoughts on Judaism and its relation to whiteness and blackness. In the third episode of this series, we discussed how Jews in America found themselves in a state of purgatory. Many of them benefited from white privilege, but when they wanted to define themselves as being more than their heritage, white people became more aggressive and began to associate them with blackness. Fanon acknowledges that antisemitism is a kind of racism. Colonial racism is no different from other racisms. Anti-Semitism cuts me up the quick. I get upset. A frightful rage makes me anemic. They are denying me the right to be a man. I cannot dissociate myself from the fate reserved for my brother. Every one of my acts commits me as a man. Every instance of my reticence, every instance of my cowardice manifests the man. He then quotes a poet named Césaire, who said that every time he turned on the radio and he heard Jews being insulted or massacred, he knew that Hitler was not actually dead yet. But he is careful to denote the difference in colorism. Fanon, being black, couldn't walk into a segregated bar in the same way that Jews could. He is detected far sooner and he faces immediate scorn. But he's quick to acknowledge that as soon as Jews are detected by white supremacists, they're not liked very much and they are similarly persecuted. We have discussed the differing bigotry of the hysteric and the obsessive, but in this persecution, Fanon wants to create solidarity. Using this line of logic, he then retorts Sartre's base assumption that all prejudices are the same, because socialism could only work if that were true. This is why Bruhl has so much distaste for Sartre, because he misunderstands why prejudice happens. Both antisemitism and racism were moments in dialectical movements, destined to be lost in higher symphyses. Blackness can be transcended, and the blacks have made their first step in the synthetic direction when they retaliate against their white racist former master by creating an anti-racist racism, by glorifying blackness. Sartre didn't want identity politics to go beyond identifying as a socialist because socialism was supposed to solve all of humanity's problems. Cool theory! Didn't work out that way. Now that we understand the basis of Fanon's critique of Sartre, let's talk about what he found useful. He admires Sartre's observation that antisemitism is not unlike black racism. It is not an instinctually learned behavior. And using this as a basis, Fanon discusses the psychoanalytic differences between the two differing types of racisms. The black man is genital. Is this the whole story? Unfortunately not. The black man is something else. Here again, our paths cross with the Jew. Sex separates us, but we do have one thing in common. Both of us stand for evil. The black man more so for the good reason that he is black. Doesn't white symbolize justice, truth, and virginity? We knew a fellow Antillean who, speaking for a fellow islander, said, "His body is black, his tongue is black, his soul must be black too." The white man practices this logic daily. The black man is a symbol of evil and ugliness. He then proclaims that perhaps Jews should in fact behave evilly. They should just embrace their Jewishness, and all peoples of color should follow suit as an act of anti-racist racism. This is in such stark contrast to Sartre that it gave me a great pause. In my opinion,
Fanon seems to be channeling Nietzsche here. Many books have been written about Nietzsche's relations and opinions on Judaism. On the one hand, many have criticized his philosophy as being a tad proto-fascist, which, I mean, it isn't difficult to jump from Ubermensch to Aryan. But on the other hand, Nietzsche was outspoken about his hatred of anti-Semitism in his own time. And quite humorously, Nietzsche asserted that perhaps Jews were just really based, actually. Maybe they just deserved to control us because they're just so awesome, which... I love the enthusiasm, my guy. Don't love the metaphor. It's kind of like his idea of slave morality, which I discussed in my conspiracism video. This morality is a Christian form of self-flagellation. We used to worship warrior gods, built on our own image, but with Christianity we now worship a sickly and meek God who died for us. Nietzsche saw Christian hegemonic morality as a way to sublimate vindictiveness. Not being able to satisfy sexual desires became chastity, etc., etc., etc. I think that this logic fuels the fires of Fanon's passions, because he's not saying he's in favor of Jewish rights. What he wants is to see Jewish wrongs. Act improperly because that's what the oppressor does not want you to do. Fanon, in encouraging all peoples of color to embrace themselves in spite of what the white oppressors feel to be evil. And that is radical in my mind. His is not a system of self-glorification, but of self-respect. It is not squashing your ideas to fit into socialism. It is about using your own ideas to make socialism for you. One last quote. I ask that I be taken into consideration on the basis of my desire. I am not only here now, locked in thinghood. I demand that an account be taken of my contradictory activity, insofar as I pursue something other than life, insofar as I am fighting for the birth of a human world, in other words, a world of reciprocal recognitions. He is reluctant to recognize me as against me. On a fierce struggle, I am willing to feel the shudder of death, the irreversible extinction, but also the possibility of impossibility. The true goal of anti-colonialism is freedom to identify and act. As Bruhl concludes, Sartre socialism means universalism, which means colorblindness, which means white. The fact of the matter is that we ought to tear down the supremacy complexes of the hysteric, and we ought to counter the obsessive machinations of the obsessives, because those are the only ways towards true equality. Unfortunately, this is quite hard to do. It is utopian in scale and ideals. Further, it is terribly difficult to shift it from a politics of inevitability into accepting change that needs to happen. The end of history itself is colorblind racism and overt white supremacy. For as long as white supremacy stands, anti-Semitism will as well. Thus we have the Kosher triangle. Any calls for Jewish equality necessarily have to be intersectional in gender, they have to be anti-white supremacy, and they have to be class-conscious. It merely depends on where you want to place yourself within the triangle. If you fall harder towards anti-colonial Marxist revolution like Fanon does, or if you believe in intersectional liberalism and incremental change would be the correct ideal to strive towards, then you fall towards Bruhl. Or if you genuinely believe that socialism in its purest forms is the correct way forwards, then Sartre is the ideal. The point is that you have to consider all three of these corners and mix and match with what you think is best. I personally fall towards the center of the triangle. I'm a centrist after all. Anti-Semitism is generally regarded to be cyclical in nature. Some decades are worse than others, but when it arrives, it reaches a feverishly violent pitch. Ancient bigoted ideas are retooled for the internet age. So my final words on the subject are this. I sincerely think that our time, energy, and resources are better spent on educating the general populace to not listen to anti-Semites in the first place, to inoculate them against repugnant beliefs. We don't need to convince anti-Semites for the world to become less anti-Semitic. We must ignore them because they have nothing useful to tell us about the practice of history, morality, or politics. They are not of this world. Thus, they don't get to have a say in how they build the future. So, we must recognize their language and their strategies in order to help Jews resist their violence. Anti-Semites have to do the hard work of becoming better people, growing, and accepting their mistakes, and then making amends for the harm that they have caused. This is the point at which we cannot help them, and it would be a waste of time to even try, because no matter what you tell them, your base schemas are incompatible with theirs. Ultimately, the final boss of anti-Semitism is not skinheads or neo-Nazis. They can definitely hurt individual Jews, but there is a far more dangerous the concept of white supremacy and capitalism as they are right now. Because after all, the true end boss of anti-Semitism is the end of history itself. I've been working on this project for well over a year now, and every time I've talked to an acquaintance about it, well, a lot of times I've talked to an acquaintance about it, they've just sort of stopped me when I mention it, and they're like, so what is anti-Semitism? Like, what does that word refer to?
it gave me pause, like some serious perspective on how far down the rabbit hole I was. Like, here I am teaching myself like psychoanalysis and just to give Sigmund Freud a fair shake, and I'm surrounded by people who don't even know what Jews are. It like really shocked me, and I'm not writing this to call anyone out in particular, like how dare they have a life, but I remain perplexed at the general ignorance I see within my own inner circle. So in this final segment, I want to talk about the value of education and whose responsibility that education actually is. I talk about my projects at university sometimes because my teachers are, for some reason, interested in what I have to say. And at the University of Tasmania, I have approached several heads of department in the media school and asked them if they knew anything about the history of antisemitism. This was an effort to find new sources and interesting takes and controversial opinions, as to make this video even more interesting. And unfortunately, none of them could share anything interesting with me, which it really surprised me when I started this, because you know, the media faculty are only the tradition of the Frankfurt School. Some of the very intellectuals who are at the forefront of the study of anti-Semitism, in fact. And just because these teachers, who I have much respect for outside of this project, can't give me the name of any books of this subject, does not mean that they are anti-Semitic explicitly. Similarly, if I asked my teacher who loved my Port Arthur series if he had any favourite books about transphobia and he didn't, then I wouldn't call him transphobic for that alone, because allyship does not equal book smarts. It is conviction and value for your fellow human beings, which are important. So the responsibility for teaching this history thus falls onto individuals at this point in time. Education seems like the lowest common denominator, uncontroversial answer for how to solve these problems, especially after like the revolutionary sentiment of the previous chapter. But the reality is that a communist utopia will not happen in our lifetime. We thus have to ally ourselves with liberals, as annoying as that is, because as such are observed, they're greater allies to Jews than conservatives are. There are plenty of Jewish resources out there that have been funded for this very purpose. Education as inoculation against anti-Semitism is not a foolproof method, but it is likely to stop anti-Semitic claims from being unchallenged. Do I think there should be a unit at school specifically about Jewish history? I don't know about that. I mean, I would have been interested in it. But perhaps instead of teaching students about the history of Japan for a full semester, and don't get me wrong, I like a good samurai as much as the next guy, history teachers could take a couple of weeks out of their busy schedules to teach people about the Dreyfus Affair. Actively interrogating the motivators behind anti-Semitism in class instead of casual retelling of the Holocaust, I believe would help kids to stop developing anti-Semitic schemas. And of course, I really do think that kids would actually pay attention to the many plot twists of the Dreyfus Affair. Obviously, there are units in high schools about the Holocaust, and from my own experience, these classes are good. You know, actually showing kids the violence that took place is effective, but I don't really know how effective these classes actually were. From my own experience as a sort of like counterpoint, I knew half a dozen boys in high school who, after the classes where they showed us photos of the Holocaust, of like the mass graves and stuff, they'd just go out and they'd just continue making Hitler jokes. Obviously going to come across some shitheads in these classes. But in my view, the problem with the current implementation of the history of World War II is that these classes don't effectively critique the legacy of eugenics. If we teach kids that Nazis are bad specifically because they did the Holocaust, and then we do not explicitly critique the institutions of liberalism and law and their special affinity for eugenics and white supremacy, then you fail to inoculate kids against anti-Semitic rambling, and they can become vulnerable to fascist rhetoric. If you believe that Nazis weren't all that bad, then the Holocaust is merely unfortunate in regards to optics. In the words of Jewish cultural critic and author Jara Horn, a generalized history of the Holocaust without a thorough understanding of white supremacy and eugenics might only give Gentiles ideas. I really think that these classes must explain the legacy of usury and the blood libel, and how these nonsensical ideas contributed towards the general acceptance and apathy for anti-Semitism in Europe. Properly understanding the psychology of Nazism can help kids recognize the how and the why as to how these beliefs are wrong. Finally, I want to talk about whose responsibility it is to actually educate the wider populace about anti-Semitism. The most popular answer is that Jews probably should be in charge, because they know the most about Jewish history after all.
This way of thinking is very prominent in Jewish life today, even among non-religious Jews, and even in the United States.
But there's a fallacy that comes up with this, because it infers that if anti-Semitism subsequently does happen, then it's Jews' fault for not educating us enough or properly.
Shouldn't anti-Semitism really be something that non-Jews should primarily be thinking about instead? The usual explanation for this is that Jews want to perpetuate the memory of these horrors so that they aren't repeated. But even that idea has an unexamined assumption built into it. which is that anti-Semitism is a Jewish responsibility.
I think that Jews should definitely be allowed to tell their stories, and we should consult them when we're trying to do that for them, but ultimately, the responsibility for education falls on Gentiles themselves.
It goes back to the ancient theological belief that anti-Semitism is the Jews' own fault, and that if an anti-Semitic genocide were ever to happen again, that it would ultimately be the Jews' own fault for failing to have taken steps to prevent it.
I'm so serious about this issue that consider this entire series my contribution towards that ideal. But if you don't feel like making a massive series of video essays about it, and you want to do your own praxis, I urge you to read and educate yourself. Even if you have to contract scurvy and drink some rum to do so, yo ho ho. If the book is meaningful enough, and you have enough extra money after you pay your 5/6 of your paycheck to your landlord, then buy a physical copy to support the author. I believe that information should be free, and it's ethical to drink rum, as it were, in the pursuit of knowledge rather than profit. Anti-Semitism relies upon ignorance to be endemic for it to function. Knowledge of Jewish history would, at the very least, hinder the spread. There's so much stuff that I cut out of this series for the sake of focus and pacing. There was going to be a massive thing about the Spanish Inquisition, Martin Luther's anti-Judaism, and even in this episode I cut out like a lengthy analysis of Hannah Arendt's work, the Turner Diaries, feminine anti-Semitism, the aforementioned cuts to the Pioneer Fund, the historic funding of eugenics, American patriot and neo-Nazi movements, and how that all ties up in toxic masculinity and whatnot. I also really wanted to talk about the National Front and Jean-Marie Le Pen, and how he normalized Holocaust denial in France. So believe it or not, this behemoth of a video is me being concise. There's probably enough here to do an episode 5 of this series, mayhaps the sociology of anti-Semitism. Let me know below what you think. But I'm tired. This video, for as effortless as it seemed, and for as dazzlingly handsome and sexy as I am, this video was very difficult to make. I had to make massive structural edits to the video to make it more cohesive. For the longest time, none of it made any sense. So I want to give a major thank to my script consultants for helping me convey all of this nonsense, in particular Emmett, who urged me to expand beyond my original analysis and construct this entire episode. By extension, I also hope that it's been interesting and useful in some way. At the end of history, there are no alternatives to capitalism. But that is through political manipulation and active participants trying to hold on to as much power as they can. We can do better than how things are right now, and Jews will be our allies in the future. Their culture and their traditions are valuable because they have been doing it longer than anyone else. Something that I like about Jewish history is that it's not always told through the recitations of dusty scrolls, but often it's expressed with jokes and a healthy sense of humor. It is a quality that I find immensely humanizing, you know? I traveled down a tunnel for a time, and I discovered how people suffered for thousands of years, and it made my own problems feel quaint in comparison. Because of all of this, in Jewish history books, you often come across jokes in lieu of explaining how people actually felt. There's a famous joke that I love from around the Great War. It goes a little something like this. A Frenchman and a rabbi sit on a park bench. The rabbi holds 3 newspapers. The Frenchman asks why this rabbi would read 3 whole newspapers every morning. The rabbi points to the first one and he says, "This one's for current events." He points to the second one and he says, "This one's for foreign affairs." And finally, he raises the final one, an anti-Semitic paper with "Jews control everything" printed across the front in large font. The Frenchman looks horrified. How could a rabbi ever read such rubbish? To which the rabbi shrugs and he says, "This one's for motivation." Thank you very much for watching. Oh, my testicles.
And what Jews can do is to stop blaming themselves, which sounds trivial or even irresponsible, but which actually requires a vast new reimagining of Jewish theology. This is something that's happened before. When the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, Jews found other aspects of the Torah to emphasize and other ways to connect with God to replace the animal sacrifices. And even though that was devastating at the time, most of us no longer miss killing all the goats. The vast upheavals of the 20th century have produced tremendous changes in Jewish political life. But what we don't yet have is a new theology that's equal to those dramas. And fortunately, the Hebrew Bible provides us with ample room to develop one. The Israeli poet Don Pagas once wrote that the worst thing that happened to Job was not all of the sufferings that he endured, but that the rabbis decided that he never existed and was only a parable. One of the ways we can begin to solve the Eicha problem would be to bring Job back to life.